there are football clubs. And then there is Manchester United, a club born in the mud and machine oil of a Victorian railway yard, built by working men with calloused hands and nowhere particular to be on a Saturday afternoon. A club that nearly died, more than once, before it ever had the chance to become anything at all. And yet, from those forgotten fields in Newton Heath, something grew that no one could have planned and no one can fully explain. A club that survived bankruptcy, bombing, and catastrophe, that lost its brightest generation in a snowfield in Munich and rebuilt, that rose, fell, rose again, and rose again after that. 13 league titles under one manager, a treble that English football had never seen. Nights in Europe that made grown men weep in the stands and on the pitch. This is not just a story about football. It is a story about a city, about identity, about what it means to belong to something bigger than yourself, and to keep believing in it even when it gives you every reason not to. 146 years. This is the complete history of Manchester United. There is a place in East Manchester, not far from where the River Medlock bends quietly through the old industrial district, where the ground was once black with coal dust and the air smelled of locomotive grease. It was here, in the working-class terraces and railway yards of Newton Heath, that one of football's greatest stories began. Not with a grand design or a billionaire's vision, not with televised press conferences or global branding. It began with working men, their boots worn thin, their hands calloused from labor, who simply wanted to play football. The year was 1878. The Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Company, the LYR, operated a sprawling depot and carriage works in Newton Heath on the northeastern fringe of Manchester. The men who worked there, engineers, fitters, cleaners, and laborers, had little in the way of leisure. Their days were long, their wages modest, and their recreational options were few. But football, the game that was sweeping through England's industrial heartlands with infectious enthusiasm, offered them something: community, competition, and a reason to gather beyond the factory gates. The club that would eventually become Manchester United was formed as Newton Heath LYR Football Club. The LYR stood for Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, a direct acknowledgement of the club's working-class, industrial origins. Unlike many clubs of the era that were founded by church congregations or public school alumni, Newton Heath was pure working class. It was football for the laborer, by the laborer. There were no blazers, no committee rooms paneled in oak, no speeches from civic dignitaries. There was a pitch, a ball, and men who knew how to compete. In the beginning, the club played their matches on a ground near the railway depot known as North Road. The facilities were, by any modern standard, laughably primitive. There was no proper seating, no covered stand, no changing rooms worth the name. Players arrived at the ground already dressed for the game, and the pitch was frequently waterlogged, uneven, and beset by the kind of industrial grime that coated everything in Newton Heath. Spectators stood on whatever vantage point they could find, and in wet weather, which in Manchester is to say, most of the time, the mud was extraordinary. Yet the game was played with fierce commitment. Newton Heath LYR entered the Manchester and Salford Cup in 1880, their first recorded competitive match. They were not yet a polished side, but they were determined. Their early opponents were mainly local clubs and scratch teams put together by local businessmen or other railway companies. Football at this level in the late Victorian era was deeply parochial. There was no national league yet. The Football Association had only been formed in 1863, and the FA Cup, the sport's oldest knockout competition, had started in 1871. The Football League itself would not come into existence until 1888. Newton Heath played through these early years in the relative obscurity of local competition, building slowly, learning the rhythms of organized football. Their colors in these early years are a matter of some historical debate, but the club is generally believed to have worn green and gold, the colors of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, a detail that would have poetic resonance more than a century later, when fans protesting the Glazer ownership would wave green and gold scarves as a symbol of the club's working-class origins. By the mid-1880s, Newton Heath were becoming a more organized and ambitious outfit. They played in the Football Combination, a regional competition that served as an early forerunner of league football in the north of England. Their performances were encouraging, and the club began to attract players of greater quality. These were not professionals in the modern sense. The Football Association had only formally allowed professionalism in 1885, but some players received expenses, and in the murky economics of Victorian football, that distinction was frequently blurred. The football culture of Newton Heath and the surrounding districts in the 1880s was vibrant and sometimes chaotic. Crowds could be rough. Disputes between players and officials were common. Referees, who were not yet neutral appointees, were frequently subjected to intense pressure. The game was raw, physical, and confrontational in ways that would astonish the modern observer. But it was also genuinely popular in a way that reflected something deep in the English working-class character, a love of competition, of local pride, of belonging to something. Newton Heath's identity was bound up with the railway. Many of their players worked in the depot. Their supporters were, overwhelmingly, railway workers and their families. The club was organized through workplace connections, and the LYR management, at least informally, lent a degree of institutional support. This model, a football club grown organically from a community of workers, was common in this era. West Ham United, for instance, would follow a similar pattern, emerging from the Thames Iron Works. Many of England's great clubs have their roots in the industrial communities that built Victorian Britain. The late 1880s saw Newton Heath push for entry into the Football Alliance, a competition established in 1889 as a rival to the newly formed Football League. The club was admitted to the Alliance in 1889, and they competed there for 2 seasons. The Alliance was not quite the Football League in terms of prestige, but it was a significant step up from the local cup competitions Newton Heath had previously inhabited. Their time in the Alliance gave them experience of organized, structured football at a level approaching the highest tier in England. By 1890, Newton Heath's ambitions had grown considerably. They had, for all their modest origins, developed into a club with genuine aspirations. Their ground at North Road had seen improvements. Their player pool had expanded. Their support base, while still rooted in the working-class communities of East Manchester, was growing. And they had their eyes on the Football League, the pinnacle of English football. The social context of these years matters enormously. Newton Heath existed in a city that was, in the late 19th century, one of the most dynamic and turbulent places on earth. Manchester had been the crucible of the Industrial Revolution. It was a city of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary poverty, of magnificent civic architecture and appalling slums, of radical politics and conservative tradition. Football, in this context, was more than a game. It was an assertion of working-class identity in a city whose working class had helped build the modern world but received precious little of its rewards. The men who played for Newton Heath and the men who watched them understood this, even if they would not have articulated it in such terms. When they won, it was a victory for their community. When they lost, it was a matter of genuine civic grief. The emotional investment that would come to define the culture of Manchester United, that extraordinary, sometimes irrational passion, was already present in embryonic form in those muddy fields near the railway yards of Newton Heath. And so, as the 1890s approached, the club stood at a threshold. They were about to enter the Football League, to compete at the highest organized level in English football. They had no real resources to speak of, no wealthy benefactor, no grand stadium. They had their railway workers, their green and gold, their North Road ground, and their desire to compete. It was enough to begin. Whether it would be enough to survive was a question the next decade would answer, and the answer, as we shall see, was very nearly no. What is remarkable, in retrospect, is not that Newton Heath became Manchester United. What is remarkable is that they survived long enough to do so. The story that follows is, before it is anything else, a survival story of a club that came within days of disappearing entirely and instead became the most famous football institution in the world. The railways that gave Newton Heath LYR their name would eventually be superseded by faster, more glamorous forms of transport. But the spirit that the railway workers brought to that muddy ground in East Manchester, the working-class pride, the competitive fire, the sense of community, that would never be superseded. It would be passed down through generations, would survive disaster and transformation and takeover and relegation and triumph, and would eventually find expression in the thundering roar of Old Trafford, the theater of dreams, one of the great stages of world sport. But that is far ahead. In 1878, it was just a football club, and that was already remarkable enough. In the spring of 1892, Newton Heath Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Football Club achieved something that had been the object of considerable ambition for several years. They were elected to the Football League. This was, by any measure, a significant moment. The Football League, founded in 1888 by Aston Villa chairman William McGregor, had transformed English football from a patchwork of cup competitions and friendly matches into a structured, competitive, and commercially viable enterprise. Getting into it was a mark of arrival. Staying in it, as Newton Heath were about to discover, was a different challenge entirely. The club entered the Football League in its first division, an elevated starting point that reflected some optimism about their potential. They had, after all, performed creditably in the Football Alliance, and the general expectation was that they would be competitive at this level. That expectation was to prove grimly mistaken. Newton Heath's first season in the Football League was a sobering education in the gap between regional football and the national stage. The 1892-93 season saw Newton Heath finish bottom of the First Division. They won just 6 of their 22 matches, lost 14, and drew 2. Their goal difference was catastrophic. The league operated a test match system at this time, a forerunner of the modern playoff, which required the bottom clubs of the First Division to play against the top clubs of the Second Division to determine who would play in the top flight the following season. Newton Heath survived these tests and retained their First Division status, but the margin was desperately narrow, and the experience was hardly encouraging. The 1893-94 season was worse. Newton Heath finished bottom again, won even fewer games, and this time the test match system delivered its verdict without mercy. They were relegated to the Second Division. It was a humiliation for a club that had entered the league with such hopes, and it set in motion a decade of grinding struggle that would define, and very nearly end, the club's existence. The reasons for Newton Heath's poor performances in these early league years were multiple and interrelated. The most fundamental was financial. The club had no significant source of income beyond gate receipts, and their ground at North Road was not equipped to generate meaningful revenue. The facilities were poor, the transport links to the ground were awkward, and the surrounding neighborhood, dense industrial working-class housing, offered a potential fan base that was real but limited in its spending power. In 1893, Newton Heath moved to a new ground, Bank Street in Clayton. The move was intended to improve things, and in some respects it did. Bank Street was a larger site with better potential, but it brought its own problems. The ground was adjacent to chemical works, and the conditions there were, frankly, noxious. Smoke and industrial fumes drifted across the pitch. The smell, according to contemporary accounts, was frequently appalling. Visiting teams complained about the conditions, and there is at least some evidence that Newton Heath used this to their advantage. Home players, accustomed to the environment, performed better than visitors who were distracted or affected by the air quality. The Second Division was, in theory, a lower level of competition. In practice, it was a desperate place to be for a club with Newton Heath's limited resources. The Second Division was full of clubs fighting for their financial lives, competing for tiny crowds, struggling to pay players and maintain grounds. Newton Heath fitted right in, but fitting in was not the same as prospering. During the later 1890s, Newton Heath bounced around the Second Division, never quite achieving the performances necessary to win promotion back to the top flight. They came close on several occasions. There were seasons when promotion seemed genuinely possible, but each time, at the crucial moment, the club faltered. The squad was perpetually inconsistent, built from a mixture of experienced journeymen, promising young players who often left for better resourced clubs, and occasional signings of limited quality. The financial situation deteriorated steadily through the decade. Gate receipts were modest and irregular. Player wages, even at the level of the Second Division, represented a significant and essentially fixed cost. The club had debt, and the debt was growing. The men who ran Newton Heath, a succession of officers and committee members who served largely on a volunteer basis, were not businessmen of the first order, and they lacked the connections and expertise to address the club's structural financial problems. By the turn of the century, the situation had reached a point of genuine crisis. The debts were substantial. Estimates suggest the club owed somewhere in the region of £2,500 to £3,000, which in the money of the time was a considerable sum. Creditors were pressing. The club's bank had little patience for further delay, and the prospect of simply going under, of ceasing to exist, was not a theoretical one. It was an immediate and real possibility. There was a fundraising bazaar held in January 1901, partly organized as a desperate attempt to generate income. It was at this event that a significant moment in the club's history occurred, albeit in a way that could not have seemed significant at the time. A dog, belonging to the club's captain Harry Stafford, was noticed wandering around the bazaar wearing a collection box. The dog attracted the attention of a Manchester businessman named John Henry Davies, who had come to the event out of curiosity. Davies was struck by the dog, which he wished to buy. Stafford agreed to sell on one condition: that Davies helped save the club. This story, part fact, part legend, as with so many founding myths, captures something essential about the precariousness of Newton Heath's situation. The club was so desperate that a casual meeting at a fundraising event, involving a dog and a businessman, could determine its survival. It should not have worked, and yet it did. Davies agreed to investigate the club's finances. What he found was not encouraging. The debts were real, the infrastructure was poor, the playing staff was mediocre. But Davies was a man of some ambition and considerable means. He was a brewer, and his involvement with football was, at least in part, commercial. A successful football club could sell a great deal of beer. But there is also evidence that he was genuinely interested in the game and saw potential in Newton Heath that others had missed. In 1902, Davies formally took over the club. He cleared its debts, restructured its finances, and, crucially, changed its name. The Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway no longer wanted any association with a club so burdened with debt and so mediocre in its performances. The name Newton Heath Lyr was dead. The club needed a new identity. The old identity, worn threadbare by a decade of failure, was about to be stripped away. The green and gold would, for a long time, be set aside. Something new was coming, something that would, in time, become one of the most recognized names in world sport. But in 1902, it was just a name change and a rescued set of accounts, and nobody could possibly have known what it would eventually mean. The 10 years between 1892 and 1902 were not, in any objective sense, a story of success. Newton Heath had spent most of a decade in the second division, had come close to bankruptcy, had changed grounds, had churned through managers, and had offered their supporters very little to celebrate. But they had survived. In a world where dozens of football clubs formed in the late Victorian era simply ceased to exist, Newton Heath had not. That, in the end, was the achievement, and it was just enough to make everything else possible. The name was chosen in April 1902, and there is something almost mythological about the simplicity of the decision. Manchester United. Two words that placed the club firmly in its city and asserted, with an audacity that the club's recent history had scarcely justified, a sense of unified civic identity. Not Newton Heath, not a railway, not a district. Manchester, the whole city, united. John Henry Davies, the businessman who had rescued the club from dissolution, understood that a new name needed to go hand in hand with a new ambition. The debts had been cleared. The administrative structure had been reformed. Now what was needed was a football team capable of competing at the highest level. Davies was prepared to invest in that goal, and his investment, modest by modern standards, significant by the standards of Edwardian football, would transform the club's fortunes within the space of a single decade. The first priority was a manager capable of rebuilding the squad. Davies and his associates eventually appointed Ernest Mangnall, who became Manchester United's secretary-manager in 1903. The role of manager in this era was very different from its modern incarnation. There was less tactical complexity, more emphasis on administration and recruitment, but Mangnall proved to be an exceptionally capable operator. He had an eye for talent, an ability to motivate players, and a commercial shrewdness that served the club well. In the early Mangnall years, Manchester United remained in the second division. The first season after the rebrand was a settling-in period. The new name needed time to establish itself, the squad needed rebuilding, and the finances, while improved, were not generous. But Mangnall was making progress. He recruited carefully, brought in players of real quality, and instilled a discipline and organization that had been largely absent in the Newton Heath years. The most dramatic recruitment of these early years came in 1906, when Mangnall orchestrated a series of signings from Manchester City that transformed the squad. Manchester City, at that point, were the dominant club in the city. They had won the FA Cup in 1904 and were a genuine First Division force. But they fell foul of the football authorities over irregular payments to players, and their entire squad was effectively put up for auction. Mangnall swooped, signing Charlie Roberts, Billy Meredith, and several other City players of significant quality. Billy Meredith was perhaps the most important of these recruits. The Welsh winger was one of the most famous footballers of his era, fast, direct, skillful, and extremely durable. He would go on to serve Manchester United with distinction for many years and remains one of the great early figures in the club's history. His arrival at a stroke elevated United from a solid second division outfit to potential first division contenders. Charlie Roberts, the center half, was another transformative figure. Roberts was an intelligent, commanding defender who also served as club captain and, notably, as a founding figure of the Players' Union, an early forerunner of the Professional Footballers Association. He was a man of principle as well as quality, and his leadership on and off the pitch was invaluable to Mangnall's developing side. Manchester United won promotion to the First Division in 1906, finishing second in the Second Division. It was a significant moment, the first divisional title of any kind in the club's history, and it set the stage for what would follow. The First Division was a different world from the second, and the early seasons were an adjustment, but the squad was good enough to hold its own, and Mangnall's tactical intelligence kept the club competitive. The 1907-08 season was the breakthrough. Manchester United won the First Division Championship, their first ever league title, finishing 9 points clear of Aston Villa. It was a remarkable achievement for a club that had been facing bankruptcy just 6 years earlier, and it announced to the football world that Manchester United were a force to be reckoned with. The squad played attacking, expressive football that drew large crowds and generated real excitement. Meredith was outstanding. Roberts marshaled the defense, and the forward line, featuring Sandy Turnbull among others, was as potent as any in the division. The following season, 1908-09, brought another landmark achievement. Manchester United won the FA Cup for the first time, defeating Bristol City 1-0 in the final at Crystal Palace. Sandy Turnbull scored the only goal of the game. It was a famous victory, celebrated across Manchester with the kind of civic rejoicing that a city which had waited a long time for sporting success tends to produce. The FA Cup in this era was genuinely the most prestigious prize in English football. The league title was important, but the cup was glamour, occasion, and history. 2 years later, in 1910-11, Manchester United won a second league title, this time finishing ahead of Aston Villa again. The club had, in the space of a decade, gone from near extinction to double champions. The transformation was extraordinary, and it owed everything to the intervention of John Henry Davies and the management genius of Ernest Mangnall. But even as the trophies arrived, another transformation was in progress, one that would define the club's physical identity for more than a century to come. John Henry Davies had decided that the Bank Street ground in Clayton was no longer adequate. The club's success deserved a stadium worthy of its ambitions, and Davies was prepared to build one. The result would be Old Trafford, and it would be ready just as the club celebrated its first championship. The story of Manchester United's first decade as a named club is, in essence, a story of rapid, almost improbable ascent, from debt and relegation to championship football in 10 years. From a club nobody wanted to one that won the FA Cup and collected league titles. The foundation had been laid, not just in terms of trophies, but in terms of the culture, the ambition, the identity that would sustain the club through far harder times ahead. The name Manchester United had arrived. Now the question was whether the institution could sustain what that name promised. On the 19th of February, 1910, Manchester United played their first match at Old Trafford. The ground was new, gleaming, and built to a scale that no football stadium in England had previously achieved. It held, at its opening, somewhere in the region of 80,000 spectators, though contemporary accounts vary in their precision, and it was equipped with facilities that were, by the standards of Edwardian England, genuinely impressive. There were covered stands, proper terracing, changing facilities that players could use with some dignity, and a pitch that was among the finest in the country. The architect was Archibald Leach, who had designed or would design many of England's most important football grounds, and his work at Old Trafford was considered among his finest. The occasion was marked with appropriate ceremony. The match was against Liverpool, which was fitting, a fixture against another great northern club, a statement that Manchester United had arrived in the company of football's elite. Liverpool won 4-3, which was perhaps not the result the organizers had hoped for, but the occasion itself was judged a triumph. Old Trafford was immediately recognized as one of the great football venues in England, and the crowds that flocked to see the new stadium confirmed the public's enthusiasm. John Henry Davies had invested heavily in the construction. Estimates suggest the ground cost somewhere around £60,000, a colossal sum for the time. Davies was proud of the achievement, and he had every right to be. Old Trafford would prove to be one of the most significant pieces of sporting infrastructure ever built in Britain, not because it was perfect, but because it gave Manchester United a home worthy of their ambitions and capable of growing with them. The early seasons at Old Trafford were a continuation of the success that had preceded the move. Manchester United won their second league title in 1910-11, adding another championship to the 1-1 in 1907-08. Ernest Mangnall's squad was still competitive, still well organized, still capable of the attacking football that had defined the club's ascent. The crowd figures at Old Trafford were encouraging, and the financial situation, for the first time in the club's history, was genuinely stable. But the good times did not last. In 1912, Ernest Mangnall departed Manchester United for Manchester City, of all places, in a move that caused considerable bitterness. Mangnall had built the club from nothing, had won 2 league titles and an FA Cup, and had overseen the move to Old Trafford. His departure left a significant void, and the managers who followed him, John Bentley and then John Robson, were unable to maintain the standards he had set. The years between Mangnall's departure and the outbreak of the First World War saw Manchester United regress. They still had good players. Billy Meredith continued in his extraordinary career well into his 40s, but the organized, purposeful quality of the Mangnall years was missing. League finishes were middling. The FA Cup provided no compensation. The club was drifting, and the growing sense that the initial burst of success had masked some deeper structural weaknesses began to take hold. Then, in August 1914, the First World War began. For football, as for everything else in British life, the war was a cataclysm. The Football League debated whether to continue the season of 1914-15 and ultimately decided to do so, while making it clear that this would be the last competitive football for the duration. The 1914-15 season was played under a cloud of moral uncertainty. There were genuine questions about whether it was appropriate to play football while young men were dying in Flanders, and attendances fell as men left for the front. The 1914-15 season was also marked by one of the more inglorious episodes in the club's history. A match between Manchester United and Liverpool in April 1915 was later found to have been fixed. Several players on both sides had conspired to arrange a 2-0 United victory, which helped United avoid relegation while providing betting opportunities for those involved. The investigation that followed resulted in lifetime bans for several players, including United's Sandy Turnbull, the man who had scored the winning goal in the 1909 FA Cup final. Turnbull was later killed in action on the Western Front, and his ban was posthumously lifted. The scandal cast a shadow over the club's final pre-war season. With the conclusion of the 1914-15 season, competitive football ceased entirely. Old Trafford, like grounds across the country, was put to alternative use. The stadium served as a military depot and training ground during the war years. Players scattered to military service, some would not return. The club's administrative structure went into a kind of hibernation, maintaining minimal activity while the world tore itself apart. The human cost of the war reached deeply into football's community. Players from Manchester United and other clubs served and died. Sandy Turnbull, despite his involvement in the match-fixing scandal, died at the Battle of Arras in May 1917. Others were wounded, physically or psychologically, in ways that ended their football careers. The world that had produced the pre-war Manchester United, with its Edwardian confidence and its belief in progress, was gone. When football resumed after the armistice of November 1918, it did so in a world profoundly changed. The Football League restarted for the 1919-20 season, and Manchester United returned to competitive action at Old Trafford. But the club that resumed play was in a very different position from the championship-winning side of a decade earlier. The squad was depleted. Key players had aged out or retired. The post-war financial settlement had created new uncertainties. And John Henry Davies, who had underwritten the club's success and the construction of Old Trafford, was an older man whose health was declining. The post-war years would bring new challenges, new disappointments, and new crises. The next chapter of Manchester United's history would be far less glorious than the first decade at Old Trafford. But the ground itself stood and would stand for more than a century, as testament to the ambition that had once transformed a near-bankrupt railway club into one of England's finest sporting institutions. Old Trafford, in 1920, was already beginning to show its age in small ways. The costs of maintenance were significant, and the club's financial position was tightening. But the ground was also, by any standard, magnificent, a bowl of possibility, a theater waiting for its actors. The greatest performances it would ever witness were still decades away. For now, it held a club that had known triumph and was about to know struggle, in a city that was beginning the long process of adjusting to a world remade by war. The 2 decades between the wars represent, in the long history of Manchester United, a period of protracted and largely undignified struggle. If the club's founding decade had been a story of survival against the odds, and its Edwardian golden age a story of rapid ascent, then the interwar years were a story of something harder to watch. Slow, grinding mediocrity punctuated by moments of genuine crisis, with only occasional flickers of the quality that the club's best years had suggested might be its natural level. John Henry Davies, the man who had transformed the club, died in 1927. His passing removed the dominant financial presence that had underwritten United's ambitions since 1902. Without Davies, the club was left with a board of directors who were competent administrators, but not men of comparable wealth or vision. The financial foundations of the club were solid enough to continue. Old Trafford remained, the supporter base remained, but the capacity to invest heavily in players was significantly curtailed. The managerial situation in this period was similarly unstable. John Robson managed the club into the early 20s before illness forced his retirement. He was replaced by John Chapman, who served until 1926 when he was suspended by the Football Association following an incident that has never been entirely explained. Contemporary records are vague about the precise circumstances. Chapman was succeeded by Clarence Hilditch, who had the unusual distinction of serving as player-manager for a period, before Herbert Bamlett took charge in 1927. None of these men had the stature, the tactical intelligence, or the resources to replicate what Mangnall had achieved in the pre-war years. The squad was perpetually modest, built from journeymen and occasional finds rather than the systematic talent spotting and investment that marks a genuinely ambitious club. In a period when Arsenal, under Herbert Chapman, no relation to United's manager, were reinventing English football with their innovative tactical approach and record-breaking spending, Manchester United looked increasingly like a club that had no clear idea of where it was going. The most dramatic evidence of the club's decline came in 1922 and again in 1931. In 1922, United were relegated from the First Division for the first time in 14 years. It was a significant blow. The club had maintained First Division status since their promotion under Mangnall, and the relegation to the Second Division felt like an erasure of the progress that had defined the pre-war era. They won promotion back in 1925, but the pattern was dispiriting. Up, then struggling, then under threat again. The financial situation deteriorated alarmingly through the late 1920s and into the 1930s. The club was spending more than it was earning. The board borrowed to cover the shortfall. Old Trafford, which had been a symbol of ambition in 1910, was now a financial albatross, a ground too large for the attendances that the club's performances were generating, with maintenance costs that stretched the budget to its limits. By the early 1930s, the situation had become critical. The club was in debt to its bank, the Midland Bank, to an extent that threatened its continued existence. In 1931, things reached their lowest point. United had been relegated again the previous year, were performing poorly in the second division, and the debt was mounting. There were serious discussions about whether the club could continue at all. The salvation came, once again, from an individual act of financial rescue. James Gibson, a Manchester businessman who had made his money in the clothing trade, stepped in with a substantial investment that cleared the most pressing debts and provided working capital for the club to continue. Gibson's investment was not unconditional. He took a significant role in the club's governance and effectively became the dominant figure on the board, but it was genuine and it was necessary. Without Gibson, Manchester United might well have gone the way of other financially troubled clubs of the era, disappearing into history or merging with a rival. Gibson's arrival did not immediately transform the club's fortunes on the pitch. The early 1930s were still years of second division football and modest ambition. But Gibson brought stability, and stability allowed for planning. In 1932, Scott Duncan was appointed manager, and Duncan oversaw the club's return to the first division in 1936. It was not a triumphant return. United struggled immediately upon promotion and came very close to going down again, but at least they were back. The later 1930s offered occasional glimpses of what might be. There were young players of genuine quality coming through. The youth development infrastructure, though nothing like what it would later become, was beginning to identify talented players. But the club was still haunted by its financial limitations and its inability to attract and retain top-tier talent. The great irony of the interwar years is that Manchester United's neighbor and rival, Manchester City, was during this same period one of the most successful clubs in England. City won the FA Cup in 1934 and the First Division title in 1937. They attracted large crowds, played attractive football, and had genuine stars in their ranks. The contrast with United was stark and humiliating. United fans of the 1930s must have felt a very particular kind of pain, watching a rival club achieve the things that their own club had achieved in a distant, golden past. The late 1930s brought a faint but genuine improvement in United's league form. Under Scott Duncan's management, and with the squad gradually strengthened, the club managed to avoid relegation and even began to climb the table. There were still no trophies, still no real prospect of challenging for honors, but at least the specter of relegation was temporarily receding. Then, in September 1939, as United were beginning what promised to be one of their more competitive peacetime seasons in years, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain declared war, and football once again stopped. The interwar years would not be remembered as a golden era. They would be remembered, when they were remembered at all, as 2 decades of drift. Evidence that without the right leadership, the right resources, and the right vision, even a club with the potential of Manchester United could spend 20 years going precisely nowhere. The lesson of these years, that success in football requires sustained investment in talent and management, would eventually be learned. But it would take time, and it would take a man of extraordinary vision to apply that lesson. That man was not yet at Old Trafford. He was, in 1939, a player rather than a manager, a Scotsman still in his playing career, with no particular reason to think that he would ever have anything to do with Manchester United. His name was Matt Busby, and the most important chapter in the club's history was still some years away. When the Football League suspended operations in September 1939, Manchester United were sitting in a comfortable mid-table position in the First Division, having drawn their opening 3 games of the season. The timing was, in the bleakest sense, almost ironic. The club had finally, after 2 decades of struggle, put together what looked like a reasonably competitive squad, and now competition itself was indefinitely suspended. History had other priorities. The second interruption of football by World War in the space of 25 years had a different quality from the first. In 1914, there had been genuine debate about whether football should continue at all during wartime, and the sport had maintained a truncated competitive structure for 1 more season before shutting down. In 1939, the authorities moved much more quickly. Within days of the declaration of war, the Football League season was canceled entirely. There was no agonizing moral debate this time. The situation was simply too urgent, the threat too immediate. In the place of the official league, regional wartime competitions were organized. These were informal by nature. clubs played in makeshift leagues based on geography, competing against nearby opponents rather than the full range of Football League clubs. The competitions were officially not recognized as real football in the sense that records and statistics from these years are separated from the formal league history. Players moved between clubs with considerable freedom, guesting for teams near their military postings, and the line between one club's supporters and another's was often blurred. Manchester United participated in these wartime competitions, and their performances were mixed. The wartime football was, by its nature, erratic. Clubs never knew from week to week who would be available to play, as military service demands took precedence over all else. Some matches attracted reasonable crowds. Others were played in near empty grounds, with supporters either serving abroad, working in essential industries that kept them occupied, or simply too preoccupied with the anxieties of war to concern themselves with football. The physical impact of the war on Old Trafford was severe. In March 1941, German bombing raids on Manchester caused devastating damage to the ground. The main stand was largely destroyed by fire following an incendiary attack, and significant structural damage was sustained elsewhere. The photographs of Old Trafford after the bombing are striking. The ground that had been one of the finest in English football lay partially in ruins, its proud main stand reduced to skeletal ironwork and rubble. The extent of the damage made Old Trafford unusable for football. For the remainder of the wartime period, and for several years after it, Manchester United were unable to use their own ground. They were effectively homeless, and the solution they found was both practical and, given the history between the two clubs, deeply significant. They arranged to share Main Road, the home of Manchester City, their great rivals. The ground-sharing arrangement with City was a measure of the extraordinary circumstances that war created. It is difficult to imagine, in the peacetime culture of Manchester football, where the rivalry between United and City is fierce, tribal, and deeply personal, the two clubs sharing a ground for any reason. But the bombing had left United with no choice, and City, to their credit, accommodated their neighbors. It was a gesture that has not always been remembered in the history of the rivalry, but it was a significant one. During the war years, United's future direction was being quietly determined by events that had nothing directly to do with football. James Gibson, who had saved the club in the early 1930s, remained in overall control and was thinking carefully about the club's long-term future. Gibson recognized that the pre-war manager Scott Duncan was not the man to take the club forward into the post-war world. Duncan left in 1945, before the war had even ended, and Gibson began searching for a replacement. The search led to Matt Busby. Busby was a Scottish footballer who had had a distinguished playing career with Manchester City and Liverpool. Yes, Manchester City first, which is a biographical footnote that few people remember, and who had served as a physical training instructor in the army during the war, reaching the rank of company sergeant major. Busby was 36 years old, had no managerial experience, and had been expecting to take up a coaching role at Liverpool when Gibson approached him. Gibson's offer was unusual. He wanted Busby not just to be a manager in the conventional sense, picking teams, organizing training, conducting player recruitment, but to have a much broader authority over football matters. Busby would control the squad, the tactics, the youth development, the transfer policy. He would, in modern terms, be something approaching a director of football as well as the first team manager. This was a significant departure from the norm, and it was a measure of Gibson's wisdom that he recognized it was what the club needed. Busby nearly chose Liverpool. The Anfield club, where he had ended his playing career, had offered him a position, and there was a real possibility that he would accept it. The course of football history, and of both clubs, hinged on a relatively small difference in the terms and conditions being offered. Gibson was prepared to give Busby the authority and the salary that Busby required. Liverpool, in the event, were not quite prepared to go that far. And so, in February 1945, Matt Busby signed as Manchester United's manager. The appointment would not take full effect until the war's end. But it was a signal, though nobody could fully appreciate it at the time, that Manchester United was about to change, profoundly and permanently. The club that had spent 2 decades drifting, that had twice nearly gone bankrupt, that had seen its great Edwardian Stadium bombed to ruin, was about to be rebuilt in the image of one man's extraordinary vision. Old Trafford would be repaired, eventually, The bomb damage would be undone by government compensation and by the club's own investment. But the more important rebuilding, the rebuilding of a football culture, of a philosophy, of a way of developing and playing the game, that was just beginning. And it would take a form that no one in 1945 could quite have imagined. The war years, for all their devastation, had one hidden consequence for Manchester United. They had brought the club to a moment of genuine reset. The old structures, the old limitations, the old habits, they had been partly cleared away by the catastrophe of the bombing and the disruption of the wartime years. There was a blank page. What Busby would write on it would define the next 25 years and cast a shadow over everything that has happened at the club since. Matt Busby arrived at Manchester United in the autumn of 1945 with a clarity of vision that was, by the standards of football management at the time, almost revolutionary. He knew what he wanted, not just what kind of football he wanted played, but what kind of club he wanted Manchester United to be. He wanted it to be a club that developed its own players, played attacking football, and competed at the highest level with a team that the supporters could be proud of not just for winning, but for the way it played. This was, in 1945, a genuinely unusual vision. Most football clubs of the era operated on a straightforward model. Identify players through a network of contacts, by those who were available and affordable, assemble a team, and hope for the best. The idea of systematically developing young players from adolescence into first-team footballers, of building a youth infrastructure that would supply the senior squad with talent as a matter of course, was not standard practice. Some clubs had done it sporadically, but none had made it a central philosophy in the way Busby intended. The first years of Busby's management were conducted, necessarily, at Main Road. Old Trafford remained a bomb-damaged shell, requiring substantial reconstruction before it could host football again. The government eventually provided wartime compensation funding that helped pay for the repairs, but the process was slow. United would not return to Old Trafford until 1949, 4 full years after the war's end. In the meantime, they were guests of Manchester City, paying rent for the privilege of using their rivals' ground, an arrangement that was both practically necessary and symbolically uncomfortable. The squad Busby inherited was a mixed collection of pre-war players, returning servicemen, and a handful of younger players who had developed during the wartime competitions. Among the senior players was Johnny Carey, an Irish defender of exceptional quality who became Busby's captain and one of the most important figures of the early Busby years. Carey was intelligent, composed, and an excellent leader, the kind of player around whom a manager can build a team. Busby recognized Carey's value immediately and gave him the authority and responsibility to match. Another key figure from the early Busby era was Jimmy Murphy, who became Busby's assistant manager and would prove to be one of the most important figures in the entire history of the club. Murphy was a Welshman, a former player, and a coach of exceptional gifts, particularly when it came to working with young players. His relationship with Busby was complementary in the most productive sense. Where Busby was the visionary and the public face, Murphy was the detail man, the hands-on coach, the man who actually put the training sessions together and developed the raw talent that the club's scouting network brought in. The Football League resumed in 1946-47 with a full schedule of fixtures. Manchester United, playing at Main Road, were immediately competitive. The squad played with the attacking ambition that Busby insisted upon, and the results were encouraging. United finished as runners-up in the First Division in their first post-war season, an extraordinary achievement for a club that had spent a decade in difficulties, and a clear early signal that Busby's management was going to be transformative. The FA Cup final of 1948 is one of the most celebrated matches in Manchester United's pre-Munich history. United faced Blackpool, a team containing Stanley Matthews, then the most famous footballer in England, in a final played at Wembley. The match was a classic. United won 4-2, with Stan Pearson outstanding in attack and Johnny Carey commanding at the back. It was a performance that embodied everything Busby had been trying to build: expansive, technically accomplished, adventurous football that overwhelmed the opposition with its quality and its commitment. The 1948 FA Cup win was Manchester United's first major trophy since 1911, 37 years of waiting, encompassing 2 world wars, 2 relegations, near bankruptcy, and the bombing of their stadium. It was an enormous moment for the club and for its supporters. But for Busby, it was also a validation of his methods. He had taken a club in genuine disarray and within 3 years had won the FA Cup and been league runners-up. And he had done it in a particular way, playing a particular kind of football with a particular philosophy. The trophies were the evidence. The method was the message. Through the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, Busby continued to build. The first team competed strongly. They were league runners-up again in 1947, 1948, and 1949, frustratingly close to the title, but never quite claiming it. The championship continued to elude them, going instead to Arsenal and Portsmouth and Tottenham Hotspur. But the work that would eventually win championships was ongoing, at a deeper level than the first team, in the youth development infrastructure that Murphy and Busby were quietly constructing. Manchester United returned to Old Trafford in 1949, and the rebuilt ground, repaired, extended, restored to something approaching its pre-war grandeur, gave the club back its identity and its home. The atmosphere at Old Trafford, even in these years, was something that supporters spoke of with reverence. The sense of occasion, the intimacy between the stands and the pitch, the roar of the crowd that the enclosed ground amplified and concentrated in a way that made it genuinely intimidating for visiting teams. Busby won his first league title in 1951-52, finishing 4 points ahead of Tottenham Hotspur. It was the culmination of 6 years of patient construction, and it was achieved with a squad that contained a significant number of players developed at the club, evidence that the youth philosophy was beginning to deliver. The first championship was dedicated by Busby to the supporters, to the board that had given him his authority, and, most pointedly, to Jimmy Murphy, without whom none of it would have been possible. But even as the 1951-52 championship was being celebrated, something more exciting was already in development. A new generation was coming through, a group of young players of such extraordinary quality that they would redefine what people expected of Manchester United and of English football. They would be called the Busby Babes, and they would break hearts in ways that neither Busby nor Murphy nor any of their supporters could yet imagine. The name entered the sporting vocabulary sometime around 1951, coined by a local journalist who recognized that what was happening at Manchester United was not just a sporting phenomenon, but a human story of unusual power. The Busby Babes, the young players that Matt Busby and Jimmy Murphy had identified, recruited, and developed through the club's youth infrastructure, were capturing the imagination not just of Manchester, but of all England. They were not merely good. They were, by the standards of their age and in the context of the football that surrounded them, genuinely extraordinary. The Football League Championship of 1951-52 had been won with a squad that still contained significant pre-war elements, senior players who had given Busby the experience and leadership he needed in his early years. But even as that title was being secured, the first wave of the young players were making themselves impossible to ignore. Roger Byrne, who would become captain of both United and England, was in the side. Jackie Blanchflower was developing rapidly, and, watching from slightly further back in the queue, were players whose names would become permanently attached to this era. The most compelling of them all was Duncan Edwards. In the language of football, where hyperbole is the native tongue, it is difficult to calibrate descriptions accurately. But Edwards was, by genuinely widespread agreement among those who saw him play, one of the most complete footballers ever produced by these islands. He was physically imposing, tall, powerfully built, with a strength that was unusual for a man of his age. He was technically gifted, comfortable with either foot, capable of passing and dribbling with equal facility. He was tactically intelligent, able to read the game in ways that most players twice his age could not manage. And he was left-footed, which gave him natural ability in the defensive midfield role where Busby deployed him. Edwards joined Manchester United as a 15-year-old in 1952, coming from Dudley in the West Midlands, and he made his first team debut at the age of 16, the youngest player to appear for United in the First Division at that time. By 17, he was an automatic selection. By 18, he had won his first England cap. By the time he was 20, he was already being talked about, without exaggeration, as potentially the greatest English footballer in a generation. Around Edwards, Busby and Murphy constructed a team of remarkable collective quality. Bobby Charlton, who would eventually eclipse Edwards in public consciousness simply because he survived when Edwards did not, was emerging through the youth ranks. a player of extraordinary technique and physical power. Dennis Violet was a forward of genuine class. Tommy Taylor, signed from Barnsley in 1953 for a then substantial fee, gave the attack a focal point of real quality. Eddie Coleman, Snake Hips Coleman, as the supporters called him, was a midfielder of almost audacious skill, able to beat opponents with a shimmy of the hips that was pure entertainment. Mark Jones, Bill Fowkes, David Pegg, the names run together like a roll of honor. The transformation of the first team from the veteran and youngster mixture that had won the 1952 championship to a side composed almost entirely of players developed by the club was remarkably rapid. By the mid-1950s, the average age of the Manchester United first team was among the lowest in the Football League. This was Busby's vision made flesh, a team of the club's own making, playing football of extraordinary quality, winning not by buying established stars, but by developing them from adolescence. The results were as dramatic as the process. Manchester United won the First Division Championship in 1955-56 and again in 1956-57. They did so with a style that was as important as the results themselves, attacking, flowing football that drew large crowds wherever they played, that was discussed and debated in every pub and schoolyard in England. The 1955-56 side finished 11 points clear of their nearest rivals, which in the points system of that era was a dominant margin. But Busby's ambitions were not confined to the domestic game. European football, the newly established European Cup, which began in the 1955-56 season, presented a challenge that he was determined to accept. The Football League authorities, cautious about the potential disruption of European competition to the domestic calendar, had actually advised Chelsea not to enter the European Cup in its inaugural season. United, when they won the league in 1956, were faced with the same pressure. Busby refused to comply. His reasoning was simple and correct. Manchester United should be measured against the best clubs in the world, and the European Cup provided that opportunity. If the Football League didn't like it, that was a matter for them. United were going to Europe. It was a brave, principled decision, and it was entirely characteristic of Busby's management style, the willingness to take the long view, to prioritize the club's development over short-term convenience. The European campaigns of 1956-57 and 1957-58 were exhilarating and instructive. United reached the semi-finals in both seasons, losing to Real Madrid on the first occasion and finding themselves, on the eve of the fateful 1957-58 return, in a position where another deep run in the competition seemed entirely achievable. The experience of European football was broadening the players' vision and the club's horizons in ways that Busby had always intended. On the domestic front, the 1957-58 season promised the possibility of a third consecutive league title. The squad was at or near its peak. Edwards was 21 and already being described in terms that placed him alongside the great players in the world game. The football was wonderful to watch. Fast, intelligent, technically accomplished, played with a joy and freedom that came from confidence. The future seemed, quite simply, limitless. And then it was not. On the 6th of February, 1958, a British European Airways Elizabethan aircraft, registration GLZU Lord Burleigh, sat on the snow-covered runway at Munich-Riem Airport in West Germany, preparing for its third attempt to take off. The aircraft was carrying the Manchester United squad home from a European Cup quarter-final replay against Red Star Belgrade in Yugoslavia. The first two takeoff attempts had been aborted, the engines had not behaved as required, and the pilot, Captain James Thane, had ordered the aircraft back to the terminal while engineers investigated. The passengers waited. Some were nervous, most were used to air travel by now, accustomed to the small dramas that long-distance club trips entailed. The third attempt was made at 3:04 p.m. local time. The runway was slushy, covered with a layer of wet snow that had accumulated while the aircraft sat waiting. The engines reached their required speed. The aircraft accelerated down the runway. And then, critically, it failed to reach take-off velocity. By the time Captain Thane recognized that the aircraft was not going to lift, it was too late to stop within the remaining runway. The aircraft plowed off the end of the tarmac, through a fence, across a road, and into a house. The fuselage broke apart. One wing struck the house, the other was torn away by a tree. The tail section caught fire. And in the wreckage and the burning and the snow and the chaos that followed, the lives of 23 people were ended or would soon be ended, and English football was changed forever. Among the dead, immediately or within days, Roger Byrne, the captain, a defensive giant who had been considered one of the finest fullbacks in Europe. Tommy Taylor, the England center forward, scorer of 16 goals in 19 international appearances. David Pegg, the left winger of wonderful skill and easy charm. Eddie Coleman, Snake Hips, whose repertoire of tricks had delighted Old Trafford. Bill Whelan, the quietly brilliant Irish midfielder. Mark Jones, the dependable defender who had given so much to the club. Jeff Bent, the reliable backup who had traveled as cover. And Duncan Edwards, the greatest of them all, the most complete player of his generation, the young man who had seemed destined for a career of unprecedented achievement. Edwards was pulled from the wreckage alive, his body badly damaged, but his will to survive extraordinary. He fought for 15 days in a Munich hospital, his constitution remarkable even in the face of catastrophic injury. Jimmy Murphy, who had traveled to Wales on international team business, and so was not on the flight, rushed to Munich and sat by his protégé's bedside. Edwards asked Murphy what the team's next match was. Murphy told him, and Edwards said he would be ready to play. He was not ready to play. Duncan Edwards died on the 21st of February, 1958, 15 days after the crash. He was 21 years old. The Manchester Evening News journalist Alf Clarke died in the crash. The Daily Mirror's Don Davies, a celebrated football writer, died. Frank Swift, the former Manchester City and England goalkeeper who was working as a journalist, died. Walter Crickmer, the United Club secretary who had served the club with extraordinary dedication for many years, died. Bert Whalley, the first-team coach, died. Tom Curry, the trainer, died. Among those who survived, Bobby Charlton, thrown clear of the wreckage, relatively uninjured. Bill Fowkes, who walked away from the burning wreck. Dennis Viollet, seriously injured but eventually recovered. Johnny Berry, a winger who survived but whose injuries ended his playing career. Jackie Blanchflower, who also survived but whose injuries ended his career. Matt Busby was critically injured. He suffered severe chest injuries and was placed in an oxygen tent. Twice, in the immediate aftermath of the crash, last rites were administered. His wife Jean and their family were brought to Munich, expecting to say goodbye. But Busby, like Edwards before his death, fought with extraordinary courage, and he survived, though the physical and psychological scars would remain with him for the rest of his life. The news reached Manchester in stages, the full horror of what had happened only gradually becoming clear as information came through. In the city, in offices and factories and schools, people stopped work and wept. Crowds gathered at Old Trafford, unable to process what they were being told. The city went into a kind of collective shock that those who experienced it have never entirely described. It was, they said, like grief for family members, not strangers. The football world's response was immediate and heartfelt. Clubs across England and Europe expressed condolences. The Pope sent a message. The British Parliament paused for a tribute. The scale of the reaction was a measure of the scale of what had been lost. Not just individual lives, precious as each one was, but a collective genius, a team of young people at the very beginning of their promise, snuffed out in a moment of mechanical failure in winter snow. The inquiry into the crash would eventually conclude that the cause was slush on the runway preventing the aircraft from reaching takeoff speed. There were other elements of the investigation that were disputed, questions about the pilot's decisions, about the condition of the runway, about whether the third takeoff attempt should have been made at all. Captain Thane was initially blamed, but was later exonerated. The controversy over the crash's cause rumbled on for decades, and some of those involved carried the weight of uncertainty and blame for the rest of their lives. But none of that, in the immediate aftermath, mattered as much as the simple, terrible fact of what had been lost. 8 Manchester United players were dead. 3 members of the club staff were dead. 8 journalists were dead. 2 other passengers were dead. And the greatest football team that England had produced in a generation, a team that had seemed, just weeks before, to be on the threshold of European conquest and sustained domestic dominance, was gone. Football has had other tragedies. But Munich is unique in what was destroyed, not just lives, but potential on a scale that has no real equivalent. What the Busby Babes might have achieved, how many league titles, how many European Cups, what individual records might Duncan Edwards have set, can never be known. The question hangs over English football history like a shadow, permanent and unanswerable. February 6, 1958. The snow at Munich. The runway. The slush. The flames. The silence that fell over a city, and the grief that never entirely left it. The first game Manchester United played after Munich was a home FA Cup tie against Sheffield Wednesday on the 19th of February, 1958, 13 days after the crash. Matt Busby was still in a hospital bed in Germany. Jimmy Murphy, who had rushed to Munich in the immediate aftermath and had then returned to Manchester with the most painful of responsibilities, managed the side. The team that took the field was assembled from survivors, emergency signings, reserves, and youth players who had never expected to find themselves in a first-team shirt so soon. The crowd that turned out at Old Trafford that night was the largest in the ground's history to that point. More than 60,000 people packed in, many of them not regular supporters, many of them simply citizens of Manchester who needed to be there, to bear witness, to grieve collectively in the only way available. The scarves in the crowd were tied to wrists and waved, and the sound from the stands was not quite celebration and not quite lamentation. It was something that the English language does not have a word for, a communal act of defiance and memory. United won the match 3-0. The performance meant little compared to the occasion, but it mattered enormously that the game had been played, that the club had survived, that there were still players in red shirts willing to represent what the Babes had represented. Murphy, still carrying the grief of his multiple personal losses, stood on the touchline with a face that those present described as carved from stone, a man doing what had to be done, determined that the football would go on. The spring and summer of 1958 were devoted to the essential but heartbreaking work of reconstruction. Signings were made, emergency additions, competent players rather than stars, men capable of filling positions in a team that had been hollowed out by tragedy. The transfer market was navigated with the resources available, and the Football League afforded Manchester United a degree of flexibility that reflected the unique circumstances. Remarkably, though remarkably seems an inadequate word for what followed, the reconstructed Manchester United reached the FA Cup final of 1958. They had navigated the rounds with a combination of the Munich survivors, new signings, and players who carried the weight of their fallen teammates on every touch of the ball. They played Bolton Wanderers in the final and lost 2-0, but the journey to Wembley was in itself an extraordinary achievement that spoke volumes about the character of the club and the people leading it. Matt Busby returned to England in May 1958, 3 months after the crash. His recovery had been slow and painful, both physically and mentally. The physical injuries had been severe, but those who knew him said that the psychological damage, the guilt of having survived when so many had not, the grief of lost players and friends, was, in many ways, the harder wound to heal. Busby had been the architect of the Busby Babes. He had brought them to Munich. That knowledge was one he would carry for the rest of his life. There was a period in 1958 and 1959 when Busby seriously considered whether he could continue as manager. The weight of grief and responsibility was enormous, and those close to him recognized that he was struggling. Jimmy Murphy was, in this period, even more indispensable than he had been before, holding things together, making the day-to-day decisions, maintaining the stability that Busby needed time to rebuild. But Busby did continue, and slowly, with the combination of determination and vision that had defined his pre-Munich management, he began to build again. Some of the Munich survivors were central to the new team. Bobby Charlton, physically unscathed but psychologically marked by the experience, was now one of the most important players in English football. Bill Fowkes, the tough Manchester-born defender, provided a continuity from the pre-Munich years. Dennis Viollet recovered from his injuries and continued to score goals. New players were brought in. Noel Cantwell from West Ham, a commanding and intelligent defender who would eventually captain the side. David Hurd from Arsenal, a reliable goalscorer. Pat Craren from Celtic in 1963, a midfield player of genuine class who would give the new United team much of its creative engine. And from below, from the youth system that Busby and Murphy continued to develop with the same commitment as before, new talents were emerging. The most important of the new generation was not immediately obvious. Denis Law, signed from Torino in July 1962 for a British record fee of £115,000, was instantly recognizable as one of the world's finest players, a center forward of electric reflexes, extraordinary aerial ability, and a goal-scoring instinct that seemed almost supernatural. Law had an urban energy about him, a wit and a sharpness that were wholly his own. He wore his collar up and his sleeves rolled up, and he played as if every match was the most important event in the known universe. The other significant new presence was not a signing but a development: George Best, who had come to Manchester United from Belfast as a 15-year-old in 1961. Best was something the football world had rarely seen. A player of such natural genius that even in his earliest appearances for the first team, in 1963, it was clear that categorizing him alongside other excellent footballers was somehow to miss the point. Best was not just an excellent footballer. He was something beyond that, a creature of the game who transformed it wherever he played. By the early 1960s, the outline of a new great Manchester United team was becoming visible. Charlton provided the steel and the spectacular. Law provided the goals and the theater. Best was becoming unstoppable, and around them, Crerand and Falks and Cantwell and others gave the side organization and solidity. The 1963 FA Cup final, United's victory over Leicester City, 3-1, was the first major trophy of the post-Munich era, and it felt like a release. The club had survived, had rebuilt, and was now winning again. The league title of 1964-65, United's first since Munich, completed the picture. The club was back. It had taken 7 years of grief and reconstruction and determination, but Manchester United were once again champions of England, and they were building towards something even greater. In retrospect, the rebuilding after Munich stands as one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of sport. To lose 8 first-team players, to rebuild from nothing, to maintain the same philosophy and the same commitment to young players and attacking football, and to emerge from that process as champions of England within 7 years, required a quality of human character that is genuinely rare. Busby, Murphy, the survivors, the new players, the supporters, they all played their part. But it was Busby's vision, sustained through grief and doubt and physical suffering, that made it possible. The European Cup of 1968 is, in any objective historical reckoning, the most significant achievement in Manchester United's history. Not because it was the most dominant performance, or the best football, or the most tactically sophisticated campaign, but because of what it represented. When Bobby Charlton held the great trophy aloft at Wembley on the 29th of May, 1968, 10 years and a few months after the snow at Munich, it was the completion of something, a promise, a memorial, an act of love. Matt Busby had dedicated a decade of his life, a decade of grief, of rebuilding, of perseverance, to winning this trophy. He had promised, in his darkest moments after Munich, that the Babes would be honored by what came after them. The European Cup was that honoring. It was the prize that the Babes had died pursuing, and its achievement by a team that contained survivors of Munich, Charlton and Falks, alongside players who embodied everything the Babes had represented, felt, to those who understood the history, like a moment of profound grace. But the European victory of 1968 did not arrive without the domestic success that preceded and enabled it. The years 1965 to 1968 were, for Manchester United, a period of extraordinary richness, a time when the triumvirate of Charlton, Law, and Best were at or near their respective peaks, and when the supporting cast was good enough to give them a platform from which to operate. The league title of 1964-65 was followed by another championship in 1966-67, United's second in 3 years, one with a squad that was maturing beautifully. The football played by this United side was, in its own idiom, as exciting as anything the Busby Babes had produced. George Best, now fully established, was the most exciting player in England and arguably in Europe, a player who could, on a given afternoon, do things with a football that no one else in the world could do. He was quick, almost impossibly so. He could dribble past opponents as if they were not there. He could score with either foot, from any angle. And he had an intelligence and a competitiveness that gave his genius structure and direction. Dennis Law, meanwhile, was at the height of his powers. 2 league titles, 1 FA Cup, European Footballer of the Year in 1964. Law played with a hunger that never seemed to diminish. His relationship with the Old Trafford crowd was one of the great actor-audience relationships in the history of the theater of sport. They adored him, and he responded with performances of feverish commitment. He scored goals with his head, his feet, both feet, his back, his shoulder, any part of his body that the rules permitted, and some that the referee had to decide about on the spot. Bobby Charlton was different from his 2 famous colleagues, less flamboyant, more controlled, but with a grandeur of his own. He was the embodiment of Manchester United's spirit, the Munich survivor who had carried the club's grief and its hopes simultaneously, who had developed into one of the finest midfielders in the world, and who would, in 1966, help England win the World Cup at Wembley, scoring twice in the tournament. Charlton was the bridge between the Busby Babes and this new golden generation, the living link to what had been lost and what had been rebuilt. The European campaign of 1967-68 was played in the knowledge that this was likely the club's best chance of winning the trophy that Busby had craved since his first European ventures in the mid-1950s. United entered the competition with the confidence of champions, and they progressed through the earlier rounds with assurance. The semi-final against Real Madrid, the club that had been the dominant European force for most of the previous decade, the club that had beaten United in the 1957 semi-final, was an occasion of electric intensity. The first leg at Old Trafford ended 1-0 to United, a slender advantage to take to Madrid for the return. At the Bernabeu, Real Madrid, still a formidable club, still capable of brilliance, turned the tie around. United found themselves 3-1 down on aggregate in the second leg, facing elimination. Then, in a spell of performance that those who watched it have never forgotten, United found something extraordinary. The resources of character and quality that the moment required. Goals from Sadler, and then, memorably, from best pulled United level, and they went through to the final on a 4-3 aggregate. The final at Wembley was against Benfica of Portugal, the club that contained Eusebio, the great Mozambican forward who was, at that time, one of the 2 or 3 finest players in the world. Wembley was full, 100,000 people in the old stadium, the largest crowd that had ever watched Manchester United. The match, after 90 minutes, was level at 1-1, Best having scored for United after Charlton had given them the lead. Eusebio, in normal time, had one moment that should have decided the match, a moment of sheer power and precision that, had the shot gone in, would have been spoken of forever. Strangely, inexplicably, he chose to shoot at the goalkeeper rather than pass, and Alex Stepney caught the ball. In extra time, something shifted. Busby addressed his players at the interval of extra time with the controlled calm of a man who had waited 10 years for this moment and was not prepared to lose it now. United's play in extra time was as dominant as it had been tentative in the closing stages of normal time. Best scored a wonderful individual goal, weaving through the Benfica defense. Brian Kidd, making his debut at 19 years old, scored on his birthday. Charlton added a fourth. The final score was 4-1. Bobby Charlton, at the final whistle, sat on the Wembley turf and wept. Matt Busby, dignified and contained throughout, allowed himself a moment of unguarded emotion. Jimmy Murphy, who had been there through everything, through the youth development, through Munich, through the rebuilding, stood and watched his players receive the trophy, and the expression on his face was something between joy and relief, and something else entirely. For the players who had known the Munich players, Charlton, Falks, the older staff members, the moment was weighted with an emotion that no sporting triumph normally carries. It was for Roger Byrne and Tommy Taylor and David Pegg and Eddie Coleman and Mark Jones and Jeff Bent and Bill Whalen. It was for Duncan Edwards. It was, above all, for the vision of a manager who had refused to let tragedy become the end of the story and who had rebuilt, twice in his managerial career, from very different kinds of ruin, a team capable of the highest achievement. The European Cup of 1968 was the culmination of the Busby era. In retrospect, it was also its end. The years following the 1968 European triumph were, for Manchester United, among the most dispiriting in the club's long history. The contrast between the heights of Wembley in May 1968 and the depths of the second division in May 1974 was so extreme so vertiginous in its descent that it seemed almost impossible to comprehend how the same institution could have experienced both within the space of 6 years. But it happened, and understanding how it happened is essential to understanding the nature of footballing decline, how quickly success can turn to struggle, and how the seeds of failure are so often planted in the soil of triumph. The first cause of the decline was structural. Matt Busby retired as manager in January 1969. His retirement was not a surprise. He had talked about it in the aftermath of the European Cup win, and at 59 years old, after more than 2 decades of management at the highest level, the decision was understandable. What was more difficult to anticipate was the extent to which the club was unprepared for his departure. The choice of Wilf McGuinness as Busby's successor was, in hindsight, deeply problematic, not because McGuinness was without ability, but because the circumstances in which he was placed were almost impossibly difficult. McGuinness was 31 years old, had no senior managerial experience, and was expected to manage players many of whom were his contemporaries or his seniors. Charlton, Law, and Best were not going to subordinate themselves naturally to a man they had played alongside. The authority that the manager's office requires was not going to come automatically from age or experience. It would need to be established in other ways, and McGuinness did not have the tools to establish it. Busby remained at the club as general manager, which created its own complications. Players who disagreed with McGuinness's decisions could, and sometimes did, appeal informally to Busby, whose continued presence meant that the new manager's authority was never fully absolute. This was not an intentional undermining. Busby was too principled for that, and his loyalty to the club was genuine. But the structural ambiguity was real, and it complicated McGuinness's position enormously. The squad was also aging. Best was still in his prime and performing magnificently, but Charlton was moving toward the end of his career, and Law was struggling with a knee injury that would increasingly hamper him. The great players of the 1964-68 era were entering their 30s, and the pipeline of young talent that Busby had always maintained was, for the first time in his tenure, not delivering replacements of comparable quality. McGuinness was sacked after 18 months, his record of results insufficient to justify continuation. In his place, Busby briefly took charge again before handing over to Frank O'Farrell, an Irishman who had managed Leicester City with considerable competence. O'Farrell's United began promisingly. The club topped the first division at Christmas 1971-72, but then collapsed in the second half of the season with a dismal run of results that left them in mid-table. O'Farrell was sacked in December 1972. By this point, the George Best situation had become the defining narrative of Manchester United's public life. Best's genius remained intact. On those occasions when he applied himself, he was still capable of performances that no one else in English football could produce. But his relationship with alcohol, which had begun as a social pleasure and was developing into something more problematic, was increasingly interfering with his reliability. He missed training, missed matches, went absent without explanation. The tabloid press, which had constructed him as a celebrity beyond the usual football frame, the fifth Beatle, they called him, the first footballer to be treated as a pop star, now constructed his collapses with equal enthusiasm. Busby's relationship with Best was, throughout this period, one of extraordinary patience. Best was, in a sense, his last great creation, the final flowering of the talent development philosophy that had produced the Babes and then the triumphant 1968 side. Busby could not bring himself to exercise the firm discipline that might, in theory, have stabilized Best's situation. Whether stricter management would have made a difference is impossible to know. Best's problems were not primarily about football, and no football manager was equipped to address them. Tommy Docherty replaced O'Farrell in December 1972. Docherty was a contrasting character, voluble, charismatic, controversial, and possessed of a tactical directness that sometimes veered into recklessness. He attempted to rebuild the squad immediately, making numerous signings, some good, many mediocre, and trying to impose a new pattern of play on a team that was fundamentally in transition. The results were not good. In the 1973-74 season, Manchester United were relegated to the second division for the first time since 1937, the lowest point in the club's history since the near bankruptcy of the early 1930s. Law's goal had not, as it turned out, been the decisive result. Other scores elsewhere confirmed United's fate regardless. But the symbolism was perfect and perfectly painful. One of the greatest players in the club's history, forced to leave by the new management, condemning his former club to the division below with a goal that he appeared to grieve even as he scored it. Manchester United in the second division. The thought would have seemed impossible in 1968, when the European Cup had seemed to inaugurate a new era of sustained dominance. But sport does not respect sentiment, and the decline that had set in after Munich's recovery was as thorough and as genuine as any the club had previously experienced. The European glory was 6 years in the past. It might as well have been 60. The second division, it turned out, was only a temporary address. Tommy Docherty's Manchester United, humiliated by relegation in the spring of 1974, bounced back with the kind of vigor that suggested the drop had been motivating rather than devastating. The 1974-75 season in the second division was completed with impressive authority. United won the division comfortably, averaging better than 2 goals per game and playing football that was, by the standards of the second tier, often spectacular. The promotion had several architects. Docherty had been rebuilding the squad steadily, releasing older players whose best days were behind them and bringing in younger players with pace and energy that the old team had lacked. Stuart Pearson from Hull City was a direct, powerful striker who gave the attack a new focal point. Steve Coppell, signed from Tranmere Rovers for a modest fee, proved to be one of the best pieces of business the club had done in years, a right winger of genuine pace and crossing ability who would serve United for the next decade. Gordon Hill, later signed from Millwall, provided thunderous left-footed shooting from the other flank. And Lou Macari, brought from Celtic in 1973, added tenacity and intelligence in midfield. The forward-looking quality of this Docherty squad was energetic and exciting, if not always consistent. United returned to the first division with a renewed sense of purpose and, importantly, a genuine change in the playing personnel. The average age of the squad had dropped significantly. The team that had been relegated was an aging one, and the team that was promoted was younger, faster, and better equipped for the demands of the coming era. The 1975-76 season brought United's first FA Cup final appearance since 1963. They played Southampton, then of the second division, and lost 1-0 in one of Wembley's more celebrated upsets. The result was disappointing, but the journey there, with Docherty's exciting young team playing attractive, attacking football, had rebuilt something of the club's public identity. United were entertaining again, worth watching, capable of generating the excitement that their large support base craved. The following season, 1976-77, brought the FA Cup again, and this time the result was different. United faced Liverpool in the final. Liverpool, who were at this period the dominant force in English football, collecting league titles and European Cups with a regularity that was becoming almost monotonous. United were the underdogs, and the final had the extra dimension of the rivalry between the two clubs and the two cities. United won 2-1, with goals from Pearson and Jimmy Greenhoff. Greenhoff's goal a fortunate, but legal deflection from a goal-bound shot. Lou Macari's shot struck Greenhoff and looped over Ray Clements into the net, and the cup was won. It was not a performance that bore comparison with the great United victories, but it was a victory nonetheless, and the FA Cup in 1977 was a genuinely prestigious prize, probably the most coveted domestic honor after the league championship. Then, almost immediately after the FA Cup triumph, another of the recurrent dramas that seemed to define Manchester United's off-field existence played out. Docherty's affair with the wife of the club physiotherapist, Mary Brown, became public knowledge. The board, concluding that the manager's conduct had been inappropriate. This was a more conservative era, and the specifics of the situation were judged to have created a conflict of interest, sacked him. The decision was contested and controversial. Docherty had, after all, just won the FA Cup. But the board held firm, and Dave Sexton was appointed as his successor. Sexton was a complete contrast to Docherty in temperament and style. Where Docherty was garrulous, colorful, and combative, Sexton was thoughtful, private, and meticulous. He was considered one of the finest tactical thinkers in English football management, and his work at QPR and Chelsea had attracted considerable admiration. His appointment looked, on paper, entirely sensible. In practice, Sexton's United were difficult to love. The football they played was often cautious and functional, effective enough at times, but lacking the color and adventure that United supporters had been spoiled into expecting. The squad was not dramatically different from Doherty's, but Sexton's approach extracted different qualities from it. He valued organization and defensive solidity over the free-flowing attack that his predecessor had encouraged. Results under Sexton were inconsistent. There were good seasons. United finished as league runners-up in 1979-80, their best finish since the Busby era, but there were also poor ones. The FA Cup final of 1979, which United lost 3-2 to Arsenal in a dramatic late collapse, was a particular disappointment. United had led 2-0 with 5 minutes remaining and lost. The late 1970s were a period of constant rotation in the transfer market, Sexton buying and selling players with a frequency that suggested he was searching for a solution he could not quite find. Jordan, McQueen, Buchan, Koppel, Hill, players came and went, some valuable, some expensive failures. The fundamental problem was that United were competing in an era dominated by Liverpool and, increasingly, Nottingham Forest under Brian Clough, clubs with clearer identities and more settled squads. Sexton was sacked in April 1981 after a run of 7 consecutive league victories. Irony of the most perfect kind, a manager dismissed in the midst of a good run because the board's patience had already been exhausted by what preceded it. His departure was regretted by some observers who felt that he had been given insufficient time. Others argued that his style of football was fundamentally unsuited to what Manchester United required. The 1970s had been, for all their moments of success, a decade that confirmed the difficulty of sustaining excellence. The FA Cups of 1977 were genuine achievements. The league runner-up place of 1980 was genuine quality, and the quality of individual players, Koppel, McQueen, Buchan, and others, was real. But the era of Liverpool's dominance had exposed the gap between aspiration and achievement, and it was a gap that successive managers had been unable to close. What the club needed, what it had needed since Busby's retirement, was a manager capable of building a sustained dynasty. Someone with the vision, the authority, and the longevity to do what Busby had done, to create a system, develop talent, establish a culture, and maintain standards over years rather than months. That manager was not yet at Old Trafford, but he would arrive. And when he did, everything would change. Ron Atkinson walked into Manchester United with a swagger that was, in itself, a statement of intent. Where Dave Sexton had been quiet and analytical, Atkinson was loud, confident, and unapologetically theatrical. He wore his jewelry visibly, chunky gold bracelets that became a kind of personal trademark, and he talked about football with an unashamed optimism that was, after years of cautious management at United, genuinely refreshing. The supporters liked him immediately. He seemed, at minimum, like someone who was enjoying himself, and enjoyment at Old Trafford had been in short supply. Atkinson had made his managerial reputation at West Bromwich Albion, where he had assembled an attacking, entertaining side that featured some of England's most exciting black players, Cyril Regis, Laurie Cunningham, Brendan Batson, at a time when the Football League was nowhere near as integrated as it would become. His West Brom had beaten United home and away in the late 1970s and had competed seriously for the league title, and his reputation as a developer of players and a practitioner of attractive football was well established. The Manchester United board's decision to appoint Atkinson was a deliberate statement of what they wanted: a manager with personality, with tactical ambition, and with the ability to attract and develop big players. Atkinson matched this brief immediately. Within his first year, he had signed Brian Robson from West Brom for £1.5 million, the British transfer record at the time, and the signing announced that United were back in the business of competing for the best players. Brian Robson was, to use a description that has become somewhat overused but in this case is entirely accurate, transformative. He was a midfield player of complete ability, combative and competitive in the defensive sense, technically accomplished in possession, tactically intelligent, capable of arriving in attacking positions and scoring important goals. He had, above all, a quality that is difficult to define but easy to recognize: leadership. When Robson played, his teammates played better. His commitment was absolute, and it raised the collective standard. He became United's captain almost immediately, and held the position for the better part of a decade, becoming one of the most important players in the club's history between the Busby era and the Ferguson era. Alongside Robson, Atkinson built a squad with genuine quality in several positions. Ray Wilkins provided craft and composure in midfield. Frank Stapleton brought experience quality to the attack. Arnold Muren, the Dutch midfielder signed from Ipswich Town, gave the team an elegant dimension that it had sometimes lacked. Norman Whiteside, who made his debut at 16 and became the youngest player ever to appear in a World Cup finals, emerged through the youth ranks with a physicality and skill that seemed almost implausible in someone so young. The problem for Atkinson, throughout his 5 years at United, was the league championship. The club won 2 FA Cups in this period. In 1983, beating Brighton 4-0 in a replay after the first game had finished 2-2, and in 1985, beating Everton 1-0 with a single goal from Norman Whiteside's curling right foot shot, but the league proved elusive. Liverpool were dominant in this era, winning the First Division title with a consistency that no other club could match. Atkinson's United could sometimes beat Liverpool. They could not consistently perform at the level required to outpace them over a 38-game season. The 1985-86 season seemed, initially, to offer the real possibility of ending that drought. United won their first 10 league games, a record start, and by autumn were looking like genuine title challengers. But the early form evaporated. The run of victories ended, inconsistency crept back in, and United finished 4th in the league, behind champions Liverpool and also Everton and West Ham. It was a deeply disappointing collapse from an extraordinary beginning, and it tested the patience of the board. During the 1986-87 season, which began poorly, Atkinson was sacked. The timing was November, earlier in a season than any significant United manager had been dismissed, and the manner was abrupt. United were 12th in the First Division, and the board had concluded that Atkinson was not the man to achieve the league title that the club had not won since 1967. Atkinson's reaction to his dismissal was characteristic: dignified publicly, privately angry, professionally philosophical. He had won 2 FA Cups, had been genuinely competitive in several league seasons, and had managed some of the most entertaining United teams since the Busby era. He deserved a degree of credit that the circumstances of his dismissal sometimes obscured, but the board had already identified his replacement. They had, in fact, been watching him for some time. He was a Scotsman, a former player turned manager, and he had achieved extraordinary things at Aberdeen, a provincial Scottish club, that suggested he might have the qualities to do the same at Manchester United. His name was Alex Ferguson, and his appointment on the 6th of November, 1986, would eventually prove to be the most consequential decision in the club's history since Matt Busby walked through the door in 1945. Atkinson had given the club some good years and 2 trophies. Ferguson would give it everything else, but he would first have to survive a period of his own that tested him in ways that none of the club's directors, and certainly not Ferguson himself, could have anticipated. Alex Ferguson's early months at Manchester United did not suggest that he was about to transform English football. The results were poor. United won only 2 of their first 8 matches under the new manager, and the football was not appreciably better than what Atkinson had been producing before his departure. Ferguson was working with a squad that had been assembled by his predecessor, attempting to impose his own ideas on players who had different habits and different assumptions about how they played. The winter of 1986-87 was a period of consolidation rather than transformation. Ferguson was still learning the scale of the task, the size of the club, the depth of expectation among the supporters, the complexity of managing players of the stature of Brian Robson. He was also learning the specific problems of the squad: a drinking culture among some senior players that he found concerning, a lack of the organizational discipline that he considered essential, and a scouting and youth development system that was not delivering young players of the quality that he expected. The drinking problem, when Ferguson addressed it, became a significant early test of his authority. Some senior players at United had developed a social culture centered on alcohol that was, in Ferguson's view, incompatible with professional excellence. He moved against it firmly, establishing new standards of behavior and making it clear that the old habits were no longer acceptable. Some players found this difficult to accept, others adapted. But the message was clear: Ferguson was in charge, and things were going to change. The 1987-88 season showed improvement in league form. United finished second, which was encouraging. The squad was developing, and new signings were beginning to have an impact. Steve Bruce, signed from Norwich City, became a cornerstone of the defense. Brian McClare from Celtic was an excellent forward who gave the attack new dimensions. Viv Anderson brought experience and quality at right back. The pieces were coming together, but they were coming together slowly, and the patience of the board and the supporters was beginning to strain. The 1988-89 season was disappointing. United finished 11th in the league, their worst finish under Ferguson. The gap between the club's ambitions and its performances was becoming uncomfortably wide, and there was genuine debate in the media and among supporters about whether Ferguson was capable of delivering what the club needed. The questions were pointed and, by the standards of subsequent history, almost embarrassingly wrong-headed, but they were understandable in the context of a club that had not won the league since 1967 and was watching Liverpool collect title after title. 1989-90 brought the crisis to its sharpest point. By the autumn of 1989, United were performing poorly in the league, and the murmurs about Ferguson's position were becoming public and insistent. The tabloid press, which has always maintained a keen interest in the managerial situation at Old Trafford, was reporting that the manager's position was under serious review. There were suggestions that he might be sacked before Christmas. The precise truth of what was decided, and by whom, in those autumn months of 1989 remains a matter of some debate. Ferguson himself has maintained that he was never as close to the sack as was reported, and that the board's support was more solid than the newspaper coverage suggested. Others who were close to the situation have implied that the margin was finer than Ferguson later acknowledged. What is certain is that the FA Cup third-round tie against Nottingham Forest on the 7th of January, 1990 has become one of the most mythologized matches in United's history. United won that match 1-0, with a goal from Mark Robbins, a young substitute who had come through the youth ranks. The match was, by any objective standard, a competent cup win against solid opposition. It was not a classic. It was not a watershed performance. But it mattered enormously to the club's trajectory, because it began a cup run that would ultimately lead to Wembley and to the trophy that Ferguson needed to secure his position. The FA Cup run of 1990 was played in the context of a league season that remained deeply unsatisfactory. United were not challenging for the championship. They were mid-table, frequently unconvincing, and the league performances did not suggest a club on the threshold of transformation. But the cup competitions have always had their own logic, and Ferguson's United, though they could not sustain consistent league quality, were capable in big matches of performing to a higher level. The FA Cup final of 1990, played against Crystal Palace, was drawn 3-3 in a match of high drama. The replay, 5 days later, was won 1-0 by United, with Lee Martin scoring the only goal. The FA Cup was won, Ferguson's first major honor as Manchester United manager, and the effect on the club's direction was significant. The security that the trophy provided, the evidence it gave the board that this manager could deliver, allowed Ferguson to continue and to begin the more fundamental transformation of the club that he had been planning since his arrival. The 1990 FA Cup was, in Ferguson's own assessment, the beginning rather than the achievement. He had cleared the hurdle of survival. Now the real work could start. The players he wanted to bring in could be pursued. The youth development system could be reformed. The culture of the club could be remade in his image. And the image he had was clear and consistent, and drawn from everything he had learned at Aberdeen and before. He wanted pace in the team. He wanted character. He wanted players who would compete for everything, every match, every week, and who could absorb the pressure of playing for Manchester United without flinching. He wanted a club that would win the league. He wanted a dynasty. He was going to get one. The transformation of Manchester United from perpetual nearly men into the dominant club in English football did not happen overnight. It happened in stages, each one reinforcing the last, each one building on the infrastructure of the previous. Alex Ferguson understood, with a clarity that his predecessors at Old Trafford had sometimes lacked, that sustained success required sustained investment, not necessarily in the transfer market, though transfers were important, but in the systematic development of young players, in the physical conditioning of the squad, in the scouting network that identified talent before other clubs saw it. and in the culture of the club itself. The European Cup Winners' Cup of 1991 was the first major international honor of the Ferguson era, and it came in a way that confirmed the manager's growing confidence. United beat Barcelona 2-1 in the final in Rotterdam, with goals from Steve Bruce and Mark Hughes. The performance was disciplined and committed, and the victory against one of Europe's glamour clubs was a statement that Ferguson's United were beginning to compete at the highest level. Within the squad, the pieces were falling into place. Peter Schmeichel, signed from Brøndby in the summer of 1991 for £1 million, a bargain of almost comical proportions in retrospect, was becoming one of the most dominant goalkeepers in European football. Tall, commanding, shot-stopping of brilliance, and with a voice that his defenders could hear from the far end of the pitch, Schmeichel transformed United's defensive organization in ways that went beyond his individual performances. Gary Pallister, signed from Middlesbrough in 1989, and Steve Bruce provided a central defensive partnership of genuine quality, different in style but complementary in effect. Pallister was elegant and mobile, Bruce more aggressive and more combative, and together they gave United a defensive platform that had been missing in the Atkinson years. Dennis Irwin at left back was one of the most reliable full-backs in English football history. Not a spectacular player, but one whose consistency and intelligence made him essentially irreplaceable. In midfield, Brian Robson remained central as long as his injuries permitted. Paul Ince, signed from West Ham, brought a combative energy that United had sometimes lacked in the engine room. And Lee Sharp, though primarily a wide player, had a direct, exciting quality that gave the team a goal threat from deep positions. But the most consequential signing of the period was one that neither Ferguson nor the club had fully anticipated, and it came not through months of scouting or strategic planning, but through a casual conversation and an opportunistic move in November 1992. Eric Cantona had become available because his relationship with Leeds United had broken down, a complex situation involving personality clashes and the kind of mutual incomprehension that can sometimes arise between a player of exceptional individuality and a club culture that demands conformity. Leeds, unwisely and in retrospect almost inexplicably, agreed to sell Cantona to Manchester United for £1.2 million. The transfer was concluded quickly, almost quietly, and its full significance was not immediately apparent. Within weeks, it was becoming clear that something extraordinary had happened. Cantona, who had been inconsistent and difficult to manage at his previous clubs, seemed to find at Manchester United, at Old Trafford, under Ferguson, in the company of players of the right character, precisely the environment he needed to express his genius fully. He was a player of a particular kind, not simply skillful but compelling, not just technically accomplished but theatrically dominant. When Cantona was on the pitch, he changed the atmosphere of a match. Opponents who had been controlling the game suddenly found it more difficult to maintain their composure. Teammates who had been performing adequately found themselves performing magnificently. The effect was partly physical and partly psychological, and it was, by common agreement, unique in British football. The league title of 1992-93 was Manchester United's first since 1967, 26 years of waiting, encompassing everything from the European glory of 1968 to Munich's shadow to relegation and the Ron Atkinson years. The wait had been so long that there was a generation of United supporters who had never in their adult lives seen their club as English champions. When the title was confirmed, on a Monday night in April 1993, when Aston Villa lost to Oldham Athletic, confirming United as champions before they had even played, the scenes at Old Trafford and across Manchester were of jubilant, overwhelmed disbelief. The celebration was not merely sporting. It was the release of accumulated tension, years of near misses, of being told they were nearly there, of watching Liverpool and Everton and Arsenal collect the titles that United supporters believed were rightfully theirs. Ferguson, characteristically, refused to let the moment become self-congratulatory. The championship was won. Now the question was whether it could be retained. It could. United won the title again in 1993-94, completing a league and FA Cup double, the first double in the club's history, with a squad that was now playing football of consistent excellence. The double triumph was achieved with a playing style that was recognizably Ferguson's, organized and defensively solid, but with the freedom and creativity of Cantona, Giggs, and others providing attacking flair. The balance between structure and improvisation, which the great United teams have always needed, was being maintained. The FA Cup final of 1994, played against Chelsea, was 1-4-0, a score that somewhat flattered the margin but reflected United's overall superiority. The double was complete, and the club's position as the dominant force in English football, the new league, the Premier League, which had launched in 1992, was established. The dynasty that Ferguson had promised, in the quiet moments of his early years, when survival rather than dominance was the concern, was becoming real, and it was about to become even more spectacular. There is a generation of Manchester United supporters for whom the years between 1995 and 1999 represent the absolute peak of the club's history. 4 years of almost continuous success, culminating in an achievement so extraordinary that it would define the club's identity for decades afterward. The treble of 1998-99, the Premier League, the FA Cup, and the Champions League, all won in the same season, remains the summit of English club football's achievement, a combination of trophies that no English club had previously won and that none has matched since. But the story of this era begins, paradoxically, with a sale and a defeat. In the summer of 1995, Alex Ferguson made a decision that seemed, at the time, either spectacularly confident or spectacularly reckless. He sold 3 significant first-team players, Paul Ince, Andrei Kanchelskis, and Mark Hughes, and declined to replace them with established players. In their place, he promoted a group of youth team graduates, young men who had been developed through the club's academy and who were about to announce themselves to the world with a force that no one could have predicted. The television pundit Alan Hansen famously declared, during the opening months of the 1995-96 season, that you can't win anything with kids. It remains one of the most ill-judged predictions in football's long history of ill-judged predictions. The kids, Neville, Butt, Beckham, Scholes, Giggs, not only won things, they created one of the most celebrated football generations England has ever produced. Gary Neville was a right-back of genuine quality, not glamorous, not a player who drew the eye with individual brilliance, but a committed, intelligent, tactically sophisticated defender who gave Ferguson's teams exactly the reliability in wide defensive positions that he required. Phil Neville, his brother, was similarly disciplined and versatile. Nicky but was a midfielder of competitive instinct and technical ability, capable of filling defensive and creative roles with equal effectiveness. David Beckham was something different. He was not the fastest player, not the most technically complete, and his limitations, in one-on-one situations, in the kind of dribbling brilliance that great wide players traditionally display, were real. But Beckham had a quality that was almost without parallel. His ability to deliver crosses and passes with precision from wide positions was, at its best, the finest in the world. And he could bend a free kick with his right foot in a way that made goalkeepers look helpless and supporters look skyward with involuntary joy. Paul Scholes was, of all the class of '92, the player whose quality was perhaps most clearly transcendent. As a passer of the football, both short and long, Scholes would develop into one of the finest in European football's history. His spatial intelligence, his ability to find and occupy the spaces that allow good football to flow, was exceptional. His shooting was violent and spectacular, and his willingness to sacrifice individual credit for collective good was the quality that made great players on either side of him better. Ryan Giggs, the eldest and most established of this group, was already a Manchester United first-team player of 4 seasons, standing by 1995. The Welsh winger had been one of the most exciting players in the Premier League since his debut, with pace that was genuinely terrifying for full-backs attempting to contain it, and a goal-scoring ability that complemented his creative work. Giggs would go on to a career of extraordinary length and achievement, eventually retiring in 2014 with 2 Champions League medals, 13 Premier League titles, and a record number of appearances for the club. The 1995-96 double, Premier League and FA Cup, was won with these young players prominent, and the manner of its winning demonstrated that Hansen's prediction, while understandable, had been fundamentally wrong. Ferguson had not just replaced players, he had installed a generation. Eric Cantona remained central to the project, until his retirement at the end of the 1996-97 season, at the age of 30, which came as a shock to everyone, including Ferguson. Cantona's decision to retire while still at the peak of his abilities was characteristic of the man. He did things on his own terms, always, and the idea of diminishing gradually did not appeal to him. His departure left a significant void that would eventually be filled by Ole Gunnar Solskjaer and other forwards. But the creative inspiration that Cantona had provided was missed. The 1996-97 season brought another league title, United's fourth in 5 years under the Premier League banner. The dominance was becoming structural. Other clubs, Arsenal, Chelsea, Newcastle, Liverpool, were investing heavily in their own squads, but United's combination of established quality and young talent consistently gave them an edge. And then came 1998-99, the season that defines this era absolutely, the season that stands alone in English football history. Ferguson's squad for that season contained the established senior players, Schmeichel, Keane, Giggs, Beckham, Scholes, Cole, York, and the young players who had now become experienced. Roy Keane had been signed from Nottingham Forest in 1993 and had become, over the years, perhaps the most important player of the Ferguson era after Cantona, a captain of ferocious intensity and competitive intelligence, the player who embodied more than any other what Ferguson wanted from his teams. Dwight York, signed from Aston Villa in the summer of 1998, formed an immediate and extraordinary partnership with Andrew Cole that produced goals with astonishing regularity. The Champions League campaign that season was breathtaking. United navigated the group stages with authority, survived difficult two-legged ties against Inter Milan and Juventus in the knockout rounds, and arrived at the final in Barcelona against Bayern Munich on the 26th of May, 1999, the date that happened to be the anniversary of Busby's triumph in the same competition 31 years earlier, a coincidence that the football gods, if such beings exist, had apparently arranged. The final at Camp Nou was a drama of almost unbearable intensity. United, without the suspended Roy Keane and Paul Scholes, were outplayed for much of the match. Bayern Munich led 1-0 through a Mario Basler free kick, and as the clock ticked into injury time, a Bayern victory appeared inevitable. The substitutes boards went up at the Manchester United end of the ground, and Ferguson's name was about to be attached to a magnificent, but ultimately unsuccessful season. Then Teddy Sheringham scored, a scrambled goal from a Beckham corner, in the first minute of injury time. And then, 2 minutes later, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer prodded home another corner to make it 2-1. United had won the Champions League in injury time, completing the treble with 2 goals in the final 2 minutes of the final match of the season. The scenes that followed, Schmeichel lifting the trophy, Ferguson embracing his players, the devastated Bayern Munich players kneeling on the Camp Nou pitch, are among the most iconic images in football history. And somewhere, watching from wherever great footballers watch from when the game is done, the Busby babes perhaps approved. The morning after Barcelona, Manchester United were something they had never quite been before. The undisputed kings of English football and a genuine force in European football's very highest company. The treble had not just won trophies. It had established a mythology, a sense that when all seemed lost, United would find a way. The Solskjaer moment, you can always score one more goal than the opposition, had entered football's permanent vocabulary. Ferguson's challenge, in the seasons that followed, was to sustain the standards that the treble had set. This was not a simple task. Teams that achieve the extraordinary frequently find it difficult to motivate themselves for the merely excellent. The mental and physical demands of the 1998-99 season had been enormous, and several key players were carrying significant fatigue into the subsequent campaign. The 1999-2000 season saw United win the Premier League again, their 6th title in 8 years, though the Champions League defense ended at the quarterfinal stage, eliminated by Real Madrid. The domestic dominance was extraordinary, but the European challenge remained incomplete, and Ferguson was aware that his squad needed renewal and enhancement if the continental ambition was to be satisfied. The transfer activity of the post-treble years was a mixture of successes and expensive failures. Ruud van Nistelrooy, signed from PSV Eindhoven in the summer of 2001, a year later than originally planned due to the Dutch striker's serious knee injury, was an unequivocal success. Van Nistelrooy was a center forward of exceptional quality, clinical in front of goal, powerful in the air, intelligent in his movement. He scored goals with a consistency that recalled the great center forwards in the game's history, and his presence transformed the attack. Juan Sebastián Verón, signed from Lazio for £28.1 million in the same summer, was a different story. Verón was considered, by many observers, one of the finest midfielders in European football, and so he was, when playing in the Italian system that suited his style. In the Premier League, with its pace and physicality and directness, he struggled to impose himself. The investment was substantial and the return was insufficient, and Verón was sold to Chelsea after 2 seasons. Among the most significant developments of this period was the emergence, and then the rapid maturation, of a Portuguese teenager named Cristiano Ronaldo. Signed from Sporting Lisbon in the summer of 2003 for £12.24 million, after he had dazzled United's players in a pre-season friendly. Ronaldo arrived at Old Trafford as an almost comically complete package of raw talent without yet the direction and consistency to make it count. He was dribbling brilliance, quick feet, overhead tricks, and an ability to make defenders look foolish that was immediately obvious. He was also unpredictable, inconsistent, and prone to the kind of over-elaboration that occasionally frustrated more than it impressed. Ferguson's management of Ronaldo's early development at the club is one of the less celebrated but most impressive aspects of his managerial career. He recognized immediately that the teenager's talent required careful handling. Praise where deserved, challenge where necessary, protection from the scrutiny that would otherwise overwhelm him. Ferguson was patient with Ronaldo's early inconsistency, gave him space to make mistakes and to learn, and gradually introduced the disciplines, the defensive work rate, the final decision-making, the physical conditioning, that would eventually transform him from a brilliant entertainer into the most formidable footballing machine in the world. By 2003, Peter Schmeichel had long since retired, and Fabien Barthez, a Champions League winner with Real Madrid and a World Cup winner with France, had come and gone as his replacement. The goalkeeping position was not satisfactorily resolved until the arrival of Edwin van der Sar from Fulham in 2005. The league continued to be won with regularity, 2000, 2001, 2003, but the Premier League era had brought new financial competition. Roman Abramovich's takeover of Chelsea in 2003 was a structural shift in English football's economics that would have significant implications for Manchester United's ability to compete in the transfer market. Chelsea, suddenly with effectively unlimited resources, began to attract the players that United might otherwise have pursued and to sign contracts at wages that pushed the market in new directions. The 2004-05 season ended without a trophy, United's first blank season in over a decade. The signs of wear were visible: an aging squad in some positions, a transfer strategy that had not always been executed with the precision of the early Ferguson years, and the growing financial might of Chelsea complicating the landscape. Arsenal's Invincibles of 2003-04 and Chelsea's titles of 2005 and 2006 were evidence that the era of United's unchallenged domestic supremacy was ending. And in the background, events were unfolding that would change the club's ownership and, with it, its financial structure. The Glazer family of Florida had been quietly accumulating Manchester United shares, a process that the club's board watched with increasing anxiety and that the supporter base was following with alarm. The implications of a leveraged buyout, where the debt incurred in purchasing the club would be placed on the club's own balance sheet, were becoming clear, and they were not welcome. The era of glory was not quite over. Ferguson was not done, but the landscape was changing, and some of the changes were going to be difficult. The Glazer family's acquisition of Manchester United Football Club, completed in May 2005, was one of the most controversial events in the history of English club football, and remains, nearly 2 decades later, a subject of fierce debate about the proper relationship between sport, finance, and community. To understand why the takeover provoked such passionate opposition, it is necessary to understand both the specific financial structure of the acquisition and the broader question of what Manchester United meant and means to its supporters. Malcolm Glazer was a 76-year-old American businessman from Florida, owner of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers American football franchise and a businessman with significant property interests. He had been buying shares in Manchester United since 2003, accumulating his holding gradually and quietly, and the club's board had watched this process with anxiety, but without effective means of preventing it. Manchester United was a publicly listed company. Its shares traded on the London Stock Exchange, and there was no formal mechanism to prevent a determined buyer from accumulating a controlling stake through open market purchases. By early 2005, Glazer controlled enough shares to make a mandatory offer, an offer for the remaining shares that the stock exchange rules required once a holder crossed a certain threshold of ownership. The offer was made, accepted by the institutional shareholders who owned significant stakes, and the takeover was complete. Manchester United was delisted from the stock exchange and became a private company, owned by the Glazer family. The financial structure of the deal was what generated the most intense opposition. Glazer did not pay for the club outright from his own resources. Instead, the acquisition was financed in large part through borrowing, loans that were then transferred onto the club's own balance sheet. In other words, the debt that Glazer had incurred to buy the club became the club's debt. The club was, in the most literal sense, paying for its own acquisition. The annual interest payments on this debt were estimated at tens of millions of pounds, money that was diverted from potential investment in the squad and the infrastructure. The supporter reaction was immediate and intense. The green and gold scarves of Newton Heath, the original club colors before the Glazer era United's red, were adopted as symbols of protest, a conscious invocation of the club's working class, pre-commercial origins as a rebuke to what was seen as a corporate predation. Protests outside Old Trafford became regular features. A group of supporters established a new club, FC United of Manchester, as an explicit alternative that would be democratically owned by its members, rejecting the model that the Glazers represented. The protest movement, while genuine and passionate, ultimately could not prevent what had already happened. The Glazers owned the club legally and legitimately. The shares had been purchased through proper channels. The supporters had no legal recourse, and however strongly they felt, however real the sense of violation, of having something communal appropriated for private profit, there was nothing formal they could do to reverse the takeover. The Glazers themselves were relatively silent in the face of the protests. They did not seek to engage publicly with the opposition, did not make statements of intent or promise specific investments, and largely allowed the storm to blow itself out while the business of the club continued. Their primary public interface with United supporters in the early years of ownership was the absence of their presence rather than any kind of active engagement. What the Glazers did provide was, in the most practical sense, stability of ownership. Unlike some takeovers, where new proprietors intervened dramatically in club management, the Glazers largely left the football operation to the professionals, to Alex Ferguson, who remained manager, and to the football structure that had been established during the pre-Glazer era. Ferguson, who had expressed reservations about the takeover and had been careful about his public statements during the process, continued as before. The relationship between the new owners and the manager was, at least in the early years, workable if not warm. The financial consequences of the leveraged buyout were real and would become more apparent over time. The debt servicing, the annual payments of interest on the loans, absorbed money that, at rival clubs, was going into player development and transfer investment. In the years when Chelsea were spending enormous sums on players, bankrolled by Abramovich's oil wealth, United were managing within tighter constraints than their competitive position deserved. The Glazers also extracted dividends from the club, payments to themselves as owners, which further reduced the funds available for investment. The scale of these dividends, when they became public knowledge, reinforced the narrative of ownership as extraction rather than investment, of a club being used to generate personal wealth for its proprietors rather than being nurtured for its own sake. The Old Trafford Stadium, which needed investment in its infrastructure, received some upgrades. The quadrant extensions added capacity in the corners of the ground, but the pace and scale of development did not match the ambitions of what had become, by any measure, one of the most globally recognized sporting brands in the world. In the years that followed the takeover, the protests gradually quieted, not because the opposition had won, but because the club's performances on the pitch, under Ferguson, continued to be competitive and occasionally spectacular. It is difficult to sustain a protest movement when the object of your loyalty is winning trophies and playing attractive football. The supporters who had been most vehement in their opposition found themselves, however reluctantly, enjoying Premier League titles and Champions League runs. But the questions raised by the Glazer takeover have never entirely gone away. They concern the fundamental nature of football clubs. Are they businesses to be owned and managed for profit? Or are they communities, held in trust for the supporters who give them their meaning? The answer that the Glazer family provided was clear and consistent. Manchester United was a business. Whether that answer was the right one is a question that Manchester United supporters continue to debate. Alex Ferguson's final years as Manchester United manager were, in many respects, the most remarkable of his long tenure. Having built one dynasty in the 1990s and maintained dominance through the early years of the Premier League, he now constructed a second peak, a period of sustained excellence that brought more league titles, another Champions League, and some of the finest individual performances in the club's history. That he did this in his 60s, with a squad substantially rebuilt from the treble winners, and in the teeth of competition from Chelsea's billions and later Manchester City's oil wealth, was a genuinely extraordinary achievement. The central figure of this second peak was Cristiano Ronaldo. By 2006, the transformation that Ferguson had been quietly engineering since Ronaldo's arrival in 2003 was complete. The Portuguese winger had become something that goes beyond the usual descriptions available for footballers. A player of almost inhuman physical conditioning, extraordinary technical ability, relentless ambition, and a goal-scoring output that made the already elevated expectations of the position seem modest. The Ronaldo of 2007-08 was, by widespread agreement, the finest footballer on earth. He scored 42 goals in all competitions that season, an astonishing return for a wide player who was not, in the traditional sense, a center forward. He won the Premier League's Golden Boot, the PFA Player of the Year Award, the FWA Footballer of the Year Award, the UEFA Champions League Player of the Year, and, at the end of the year, the Ballon d'Or, the most prestigious individual award in world football. He was, in that season, arguably the finest player in the history of the position. Wayne Rooney, purchased from Everton in 2004 for £25.6 million when he was still 18 years old, had developed into one of the most compelling center forwards in English football. Powerful, quick, technically accomplished, and with a competitive aggression that expressed itself in brilliance as often as it did in the occasional disciplinary transgression. His partnership with Ronaldo was one of the most potent attacking combinations in Europe, and it drove United's successes in this period. The Premier League title of 2006-07 was followed by the extraordinary double of 2007-08, Premier League and Champions League, the latter one in a penalty shootout against Chelsea in Moscow. The final in the Luzhniki Stadium was played in driving rain, and the match itself was tense and dramatic rather than beautiful. United led through a Ronaldo header. Chelsea equalized through Frank Lampard. The match went to penalties, and in the shootout, John Terry, Chelsea's captain, slipped as he stepped up to take the kick that would have won the trophy for Chelsea, and his penalty missed. Edwin van der Sar saved Nicolas Anelka's subsequent penalty, and the trophy was United's. The Moscow final was significant for several reasons. It was Ferguson's second Champions League win, confirming his status as one of the greatest managers in the history of the game. It was Ronaldo's peak moment in a United shirt. He would leave for Real Madrid the following summer, in a world record £80 million transfer that was eventually agreed after a period of sustained speculation. And it was a demonstration that even in an era of vast competing expenditure, Ferguson could still build a team capable of the highest achievement. After Ronaldo's departure, which was managed with a degree of bitterness on both sides, the player having reportedly wanted to leave sooner than was convenient, United went through a period of adjustment. The 2008-09 season brought another league title, United's third in a row, and another Champions League final appearance, this time against Barcelona in Rome. The Barca of Pep Guardiola was, in this period, the finest club team in the world, and they demonstrated the fact comprehensively at the Olympic Stadium. United were beaten 2-0 and could have no serious complaint about the result. The Barcelona of Messi, Xavi, and Iniesta was playing a style of football that United, for all their quality, were not equipped to match. The The final years of the Ferguson era, 2010 to 2013, brought more league titles, 2010-11, 2012-13. The latter was Ferguson's 13th Premier League title, and it was won with a certain serenity. United ran away with the division, eventually finishing 11 points clear of Manchester City, who had themselves disrupted the competitive landscape with their takeover by Abu Dhabi Capital in 2008. The rise of City, who won the league in extraordinary last-gasp circumstances in 2012, was a challenge that Ferguson met with characteristic competitive intensity. Wayne Rooney, Robin van Persie, signed from Arsenal in the summer of 2012 and immediately devastating in front of goal, and Michael Carrick gave the 2012-13 squad a quality that was undeniable. The 2012-13 title was won emphatically, and there was nothing in United's performance that season to suggest it would be the last under their manager of 27 years. And then, in May 2013, Alex Ferguson announced his retirement. The announcement came suddenly, though in retrospect some who knew him well had sensed it coming. He was 71 years old. He had been manager since 1986. He had won 13 Premier League titles, 5 FA Cups, 4 League Cups, 2 Champions Leagues, a UEFA Cup Winners' Cup, and a Super Cup. He was, by any measure, the most successful football manager in English football history and arguably the greatest club manager the game had known. The emotional reaction across football, not just at Manchester United, was extraordinary. Even supporters of rival clubs, who had spent years resenting his success and his occasionally cantankerous press conference manner, acknowledged that something genuinely rare had just stepped back from the game. The era of Ferguson was over, and nobody knew quite what came next. The successor Ferguson chose, or at least the man whom the club appointed with Ferguson's blessing, was David Moyes, the Everton manager who had spent 11 years building Everton into a competitive Premier League outfit on a fraction of the resources available to their rivals. Moyes was a conscientious, thoughtful, defensively organized manager who had achieved genuine results with limited means. He was, in other words, the precise opposite of what Manchester United needed. The appointment reflected, perhaps, a misunderstanding of what had made Ferguson's United successful. The assumption seemed to be that the infrastructure Ferguson had built, the training ground, the scouting network, the culture of the club, would sustain whoever sat in the manager's chair. The assumption was wrong. What Ferguson had built was an organization that ran on his specific authority, his specific personality, his specific ability to manage individuals and sustain collective performance over long periods. Remove Ferguson and the organization did not simply continue. It needed someone of comparable stature to maintain it. Moyes was not that person, and it became clear very quickly. The 2013-14 season was, from almost its first match, a crisis in slow motion. United won their opening Premier League game but then began to lose, to Liverpool, to Manchester City, to Arsenal, to Tottenham, at a frequency and with a convincing margin that had not been seen since the darkest of the post-Munich years. The football was often confused and laborious. The team looked as though they did not know what they were supposed to be doing, as though the instructions they were receiving conflicted with the habits they had developed. Moyes' relationship with some senior players was reportedly difficult. Wayne Rooney, who had expected to be the central creative figure of the new era, found his role uncertain. The midfield, which under Ferguson had been organized with the assured hand of an expert juggler, was now muddy and directionless. New signings, Marouane Fellaini, signed from Everton on deadline day for an overpriced £27.5 million, failed to make the expected impact. By March 2014, United were 7th in the Premier League, an unthinkable position for a club that had finished first the previous May. The board's patience was exhausted, and Moyes was sacked after less than 10 months in the job. It was a decisive action and a correct one, but the damage to the season was irreparable. Ryan Giggs, who had remained at the club as a player-coach, took charge on an interim basis for the remaining matches, a role he performed with quiet professionalism but without the mandate to make substantive changes. The season ended with United 7th, their worst league finish since 1990 and a humiliation for a club of their stature. The permanent replacement for Moyes was Louis van Gaal, the Dutch manager whose CV included league titles in 3 different countries, a Champions League with Ajax, and periods of management at Barcelona and Bayern Munich. Van Gaal was an entirely different personality from Moyes, assertive, theory-heavy, inclined to elaborate tactical frameworks, and comfortable in the company of very big egos. His appointment suggested that the club was taking the rebuild seriously. Van Gaal's 2 seasons at United, 2014-15 and 2015-16, were among the most peculiar in the club's recent history. The football he produced was, at its worst, extraordinarily cautious, slow-build possession play that seemed designed to remove all spontaneity from the attack. Wayne Rooney was deployed in midfield, a decision that baffled supporters. Memphis Depay, signed from PSV Eindhoven for £25 million as a replacement level for Ronaldo, failed comprehensively to justify the fee or the hype. And yet, through the tactical conservatism and the occasional brilliance-free performances, the foundations of a squad were being assembled. Ander Herrera, signed from Athletic Club, became a popular and effective midfielder. Juan Mata was a creative intelligence. Timothy Fosu-Mensah, Paddy McNair, and other young players were given opportunities. And there were good days, the League Cup run, certain individual performances. The FA Cup win of 2016, United's first in 12 years, defeating Crystal Palace 2-1 in a final that required extra time, and a spectacular Jesse Lingard goal, provided Van Gaal's tenure with its single moment of genuine trophy success. It was achieved, however, against the backdrop of continued Premier League underperformance. United finished 5th and then 4th in Van Gaal's 2 full seasons, failing to qualify for the Champions League in 2014-15. Van Gaal's departure, announced the day after the FA Cup final, was managed with an awkwardness that has become emblematic of United's post-Ferguson executive decisions. The Dutchman, who had believed his position was secure following the Cup win, learned of his sacking through media reports rather than through formal communication from the club. It was not a procedure that reflected well on the club's leadership. The 3 years between Ferguson's retirement and Van Gaal's departure had cost Manchester United significantly. In Premier League position, in Champions League participation, in the quality of squad development, and in the confidence of the supporter base. The club that had dominated English football for 2 decades was now a club scrambling to re-establish relevance. The question of who came next, and whether they could rebuild what had been lost, was the central football question of the moment. The answer the club chose was Jose Mourinho, a man who had won leagues and cups and Champions Leagues at Porto, Chelsea, Inter Milan, and Real Madrid, and who was the most celebrated club manager of his generation after Ferguson himself. It was, on paper, a compelling appointment. In practice, as with so many of Manchester United's post-Ferguson decisions, the reality was more complicated than the theory. Jose Mourinho arrived at Manchester United in the summer of 2016, carrying the weight of his own considerable reputation and the expectations of a supporter base that had waited 3 years for a manager of genuine stature. He had won the Premier League twice with Chelsea, had built Inter Milan into European champions with his trademark defensive solidity and intense competitive psychology, and had managed Real Madrid, one of the few clubs in the world whose demands and scrutiny exceed those of Manchester United. What Mourinho brought to Old Trafford was clarity of purpose, organizational intelligence, and a tactical system that, when properly implemented, was extremely difficult to beat. What he also brought, as he had brought to every club he had managed, was a personality that was as divisive as it was compelling, confrontational with the media, demanding of his players, and occasionally brilliant at the political management of a dressing room, but also capable of creating the kind of internal tensions that, over time, can undermine even the most talented collective. The first season, 2016-17, produced results that were, in the context of the previous 3 years, a genuine step forward. United finished 6th in the Premier League, which was not the improvement their ambition demanded, but they won the League Cup, defeating Southampton 3-2, and the Europa League, a genuinely significant achievement in a competition that UEFA had elevated in prestige. The Europa League final against Ajax in Stockholm was 1-0, with goals from Pogba and Mkhitaryan, and the trophy gave United entry into the Champions League for the following season. The shadow over the 2016-17 season was cast by an event in May 2017 that had nothing to do with football: the the Manchester Arena bombing, which killed 22 people at an Ariana Grande concert in the city. The response of Manchester United, the club, the players, the management, was one of the most touching displays of civic solidarity in the club's long history. Players visited hospitals. The club offered whatever support it could. The city's grief was the club's grief, and the manner in which United expressed that connection reminded everyone of what football clubs mean to their communities at the deepest level. Paul Pogba, re-signed from Juventus in the summer of 2016 for a then world record £89 million, was the central figure of Mourinho's project and also its central source of tension. Pogba was a midfielder of extraordinary physical gifts, tall, powerful, technically refined, and capable of the kind of long-range pass and sudden acceleration that no amount of coaching can teach. He was also a personality of unusual complexity, charismatic and engaging in public, but reportedly difficult to manage consistently, and prone to the kind of form fluctuation that frustrated Mourinho intensely. The relationship between Mourinho and Pogba was the defining drama of the era. There were periods when Pogba was the best player in the Premier League. The Paris Saint-Germain game in March 2019, when he scored twice in a famous win, gave a glimpse of what a fully committed Pogba looked like. There were also long stretches when he seemed disengaged, when the body language suggested friction with the manager, and when his performances did not justify the investment made in signing him. Romelu Lukaku, signed from Everton for £75 million in the summer of 2017, was a more straightforward story. A center-forward of pace and physical presence who scored goals with reasonable regularity, but whose overall link play and technical quality in tight spaces left something to be desired. He was not the complete striker that Mourinho needed, though his contribution in his first season, 16 Premier League goals, was solid. The 2017-18 season was deeply unsatisfying. United finished second in the Premier League, a respectable result in isolation, but they were 19 points behind champions Manchester City, who under Pep Guardiola played some of the most devastating football that the Premier League had ever seen. The gap between United and City in that season was the gap between a manager and a squad finding their way and a manager and a squad expressing something close to genius. City's football was tactically intricate, physically relentless, and aesthetically thrilling. United's was often functional, sometimes effective, rarely beautiful. The Champions League campaign ended at the last 16 stage, United beaten by Sevilla. The FA Cup run ended in the semi-finals, United beaten by Tottenham at Wembley. The trophies, other than the previous season's Europa League, were not coming. The 2018-19 season began badly and got worse. United lost to Brighton at home on the opening day. They lost to Tottenham. They lost to Derby County in the League Cup, a result that would have been extraordinary in any period of the club's history but was, in the context of this era, simply another dispiriting addition to a growing collection. By December 2018, the situation was untenable. United were sixth in the table, 17 points behind leaders Liverpool, and the football was characterized by a defensiveness and a joylessness that bore no relation to the club's historical identity. Mourinho was sacked on the 18th of December 2018, the day after a 3-1 defeat to Liverpool, his final match. His record at United, 1 Europa League, 1 League Cup, was not nothing, but against the backdrop of the enormous investment in players during his tenure and the expectations of the position, it was inadequate. More importantly, the manner of the football during Mourinho's tenure had been alienating. United supporters could accept losing. They could not accept performances that seemed to represent a philosophical rejection of everything the club stood for. The attacking tradition that ran from Busby through Ferguson was not visible in Mourinho's United. The dressing room tensions were not invisible, and the sense that the club was managed for self-protection rather than for expression was corrosive. The post-Mourinho era would begin with an interim and proceed to a permanent appointment, one of the most consequential in the club's post-Ferguson history. But getting that appointment right would prove more difficult than it looked. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, the man who had scored the goal that won the 1999 Champions League, the most celebrated single moment in the club's recent history, was appointed as caretaker manager when Mourinho was dismissed in December 2018. The appointment carried obvious emotional resonance. Here was a man whose identity was inseparable from the greatest moment of the modern club, a man whose relationship with the supporters was one of the warmest in recent memory, and a man who represented, however symbolically, a return to the values and the spirit that the club had seemed to lose during the Mourinho years. The early weeks of Solskjaer's tenure were extraordinary. United played 8 Premier League games under their new caretaker and won all 8. The football changed dramatically. It was expansive, direct, fast, and exciting. Marcus Rashford, who had been constrained under Mourinho, was suddenly a constant threat. Anthony Martial, similarly liberated, was producing performances of genuine quality. Jesse Lingard, whose form had been dire, was contributing goals and assists. The players seemed happier. The football seemed, again, to have some relation to the club's traditions. The transformation was widely attributed to the new manager's personality and his relationship with the players. Solskjaer was, by temperament, an encourager, a manager who believed in building players up, in supporting them through difficulties rather than confronting them with public criticism. This approach seemed, in the short term, spectacularly effective. Solskjaer was given the permanent job in March 2019, a decision that seemed, at the time, defensible. The results had been excellent. The mood had improved dramatically, and the faith in his ability to translate the caretaker effect into sustained progress was genuine. What followed was 3.5 years that told a complicated story about the relationship between personality, tactics, and sustained excellence. The problem with Solskjaer's United was one of ceiling. When the team was in form, when the players' confidence was high, United were capable of genuinely impressive performances. They beat Paris Saint-Germain over 2 legs in the Champions League in 2019. They finished second in the Premier League in 2020-21, their best result since Ferguson retired. They won the League Cup in 2023, though that was after Solskjaer's departure. But the ceiling of the performances never reached the level that a club of Manchester United's resources and history should expect. And the floor, the level of performance when things were going wrong, was sometimes alarmingly low. The squad assembled during Solskjaer's tenure was one of the most expensive in Premier League history, but also one of the most inconsistent. Harry Maguire, signed from Leicester City for £80 million in the summer of 2019, the most expensive defender in the history of football at that point, was a capable, if sometimes error-prone central defender whose profile and price tag made every mistake a major news event. Bruno Fernandes, signed from Sporting Lisbon in January 2020, was an immediate and transformative presence, a creative midfielder of real quality whose passing, movement, and eye for goal gave United an attacking dimension they had been missing. Jadon Sancho, signed from Borussia Dortmund for £73 million in the summer of 2021, arrived with enormous expectations, a wide player who had been outstanding in German football and who was meant to give United a consistent goal threat from the right. His adaptation to English football was slow and sometimes painful. It took more than a year for him to produce the form that had justified the fee, and in the interim, the pressure of the transfer fee and the scrutiny of Old Trafford weighed heavily. Cristiano Ronaldo returned to Manchester United in the summer of 2021, in a transfer that was driven partly by sentiment and partly by the fear of losing him to Manchester City. Ronaldo, now 36, no longer the explosive wide player of his first United spell, but an extraordinary goalscorer who had reinvented himself as a pure penalty box predator, signed a 2-year contract and immediately began scoring goals. His return was initially celebrated by supporters who remembered 2008 and the goals and the joy of his first incarnation in red. But Ronaldo's second United spell was uncomfortable in ways that went beyond his individual performances. His presence in the team raised structural questions. Was United a team that could press high and work hard without the ball, the modern default, or a team built around a player who did not press and whose defensive contribution was limited? Could you build a team around a player of Ronaldo's profile in the tactical context of 2021? The tension between what Ronaldo brought in goals and what his presence cost in tactical flexibility was never satisfactorily resolved. Solskjaer was sacked in November 2021 following a 4-1 defeat to Watford. The manner of United's collapse under him, from genuine second-place contenders in May to a team being beaten at Watford in October, was symptomatic of the fragility that had characterized his entire tenure. When things were good, they were genuinely good. When they fell apart, they fell apart with a totality that exposed the team's structural weaknesses. Ralf Rangnick, a German manager of considerable intellectual reputation, was brought in as interim manager for the second half of the 2021-22 season. Rangnick was a theorist of the pressing game. His tactical ideas had influenced many of the most successful managers of the modern era, including Klopp and Tuchel. But his time at United was largely unsuccessful, his ideas imperfectly implemented by a squad that had been trained in different habits, and his relationship with some senior players reportedly difficult. United finished 6th in the Premier League in 2021-22, below any realistic expectation for a club of their means and history. The summer of 2022 brought a new permanent appointment, a new set of promises, and the question of whether the pattern of the previous 9 years was going to be broken or repeated. Erik ten Hag arrived at Manchester United in the summer of 2022 with a reputation as one of the most tactically sophisticated managers in European football. His Ajax, the club he had managed since 2017, had played some of the most breathtaking football on the continent. Quick, vertical, intensely organized, pressing high and creating opportunities through collective movement rather than individual brilliance. Ajax had reached the Champions League semi-finals in 2019, eliminating Juventus and Real Madrid along the way, before falling to Tottenham in the most dramatic of circumstances. The football they had played in that run was considered, by many observers, among the finest produced by any club in Europe in recent memory. Ten Hag's appointment was different in character from the post-Ferguson appointments that had preceded it. Where Moyes had been a conservative choice and Mourinho a prestige choice, Ten Hag was a football choice, a manager selected specifically for the tactical approach he represented and the ability to implement it at the highest level. He was 42 years old, Dutch, meticulous in preparation, and he had thought carefully about what he was taking on. The first months of the appointment were testing. United lost their first 2 Premier League games, to Brighton and to Brentford, the latter 4-0 in a performance that recalled the worst of the post-Ferguson years. The reaction of the manager was instructive. Ten Hag did not panic, did not make wholesale changes, and did not publicly criticize his players. He worked. He implemented his methods with the patience and consistency that his approach required, and he told anyone who would listen that the process would take time. He was right. The reaction after the Brentford defeat, a 2-1 win over Liverpool, with Manchester United's press forcing errors and creating chances in the high press exactly as Ten Hag's system demanded, was the turning point of the early season. United went on to win their next 6 games, and the trajectory of improvement was visible and real. The most significant decisions of Ten Hag's early tenure involved Cristiano Ronaldo, whose relationship with the club had become untenable. Ronaldo had given an interview to journalist Piers Morgan in November 2022 in which he attacked the club, the manager, and several other individuals in terms that made his continued presence impossible. He was released by mutual consent, terminating a second spell that had become increasingly problematic, and left the club he had first represented as an 18-year-old nearly 20 years before. The departure was handled with less ceremony than Ronaldo's legacy deserved. The ending was messy and public and unworthy of someone who had been, in his first United spell, one of the greatest players in the club's history. But the departure was necessary, and it cleared the way for Ten Hag to build the team in the tactical image he had planned. Manchester United won the League Cup in the spring of 2023, Ten Hag's first trophy as United manager, and the club's first major honor since 2017. The final, played against Newcastle United at Wembley, was 1-2-0, with goals from Case Moreau and Marcus Rashford. It was not a spectacular match, but it was a victory, and its significance, the first trophy of a new era, the signal that the rebuilding was producing tangible results, was considerable. The FA Cup final of 2024 provided another significant achievement, a trophy that confirmed United's return to relevance in the domestic competition. Against Manchester City, the defending champions in what might have appeared their natural territory, United won 2-1 with goals that demonstrated both the quality of the players available to Ten Hag and the tactical clarity that his coaching had instilled. The victory was celebrated with genuine joy, not the overwhelmed disbelief of 1993, not the historic weight of 1968, but the straightforward pleasure of a club that had found its competitive edge again. The transfer business under Ten Hag has reflected both ambition and constraint. Antony, signed from Ajax for £85 million, represented a substantial investment that has not always been matched by consistent performance, a frustrating pattern familiar from recent United history. Casemiro, the Brazilian defensive midfielder signed from Real Madrid, was a more immediate success, an experienced, controlling presence who gave the midfield the organizational intelligence it had been missing. Lisandro Martinez, the Argentine central defender who had worked under Ten Hag at Ajax, was an early standout, a fierce, combative, technically accomplished defender who brought a mentality to United's backline that had been absent. The question of ownership remained a live issue throughout this period. The Glazer family had announced in November 2022 that they were considering selling the club, or, more precisely, that they were exploring strategic alternatives, a formulation that could mean anything from a full sale to a partial stake offering. The process attracted significant interest. Sir Jim Ratcliffe, a British billionaire with involvement in various sporting projects, including Nice Football Club and the Ineos team in Formula One, emerged as the most serious contender for a stake. In early 2024, Ratcliffe's Ineos Group completed a purchase of approximately 25% of Manchester United, acquiring the element that controlled the football operation, the management structure, the training ground decisions, the sporting director function. The Glazers retained majority ownership, but the effective day-to-day football leadership passed to Ineos and the structures Ratcliffe and his associates would establish. The appointment of Dan Ashworth, formerly of Newcastle United and the Football Association, as sporting director was part of this new structure, though the process of that appointment was complicated by legal delays and protracted negotiations with Newcastle. The building of a proper executive infrastructure around the football operation, which had been a conspicuous absence in the post-Ferguson years, was a priority for the new leadership. Marcus Rashford, the club's most prominent homegrown talent of the modern era, represented both the potential and the complexity of the rebuild. A product of United's academy, Rashford had scored goals in moments of genuine brilliance. The 2023 League Cup campaign, certain individual displays in European competition, but his form had also been inconsistent and his off-field profile occasionally a source of distraction. His future at the club became a subject of sustained debate heading into the mid-2020s. The stadium question, what to do about Old Trafford, which after more than a century of use requires either extensive renovation or replacement, is among the most significant decisions facing the club's leadership in the coming years. The ground that opened in 1910 has grown and adapted with the club for more than 100 years, but it now lags behind the facilities available at rival clubs in terms of modern amenities and commercial capacity. The options: renovate the existing structure or build a new ground nearby. Each carry extraordinary cost and complexity, and the choice will define the club's physical identity for the next century. Manchester United in the mid-2020s is a club in genuine transition. The post-Ferguson years have been characterized by upheaval, by expensive failures, by a search for identity and consistent excellence that has only intermittently been successful. The gap between the club's historical standing and its recent performance has been one of the defining tensions in English football. But the foundations that give genuine grounds for optimism are also real. The supporter base, measured in global terms, one of the largest of any sporting club in the world, remains engaged and passionate. The Youth Academy, which produced the class of '92 and has developed other talents since, continues to identify and develop young players of quality. The Old Trafford atmosphere, when the occasion demands it, is still among the most intense and affecting in English football. And the appointment of Ten Hag and the Ineos restructuring represent, at minimum, a more coherent strategic vision than anything that preceded them in the decade after Ferguson. The deeper question, whether Manchester United can build the kind of sustained excellence that characterized the Busby era and the Ferguson era, in the radically different financial and competitive landscape of modern football, remains open. The Premier League of the 2020s is more competitive, more global, more financially diverse than anything that existed when Busby won his first title or Ferguson won his last. The tools required to compete have changed. What has not changed is the expectation. Manchester United supporters, in Manchester, in England, In every country where the club's colors have found admirers, expect more than mid-table finishes and cup consolations. They expect the league. They expect Europe. They expect, above all, football that makes them proud not just in its results, but in its manner, attacking, committed, expressing the traditions that run back through Ferguson to Busby to the founding of Newton Heath in 1878. The history of this club is a history of survival and of ambition, of a railway club that became a global institution, of a near-bankrupt Victorian team that became European champions, of a club that survived actual disaster, the bombing, Munich, and rebuilt each time with something that, somehow, exceeded what came before. Whether the modern club can add another chapter of that quality to that story is, as of this writing, a question without a definitive answer. But the story is not over. It never has been, and it never will be. Somewhere in Manchester, right now, a child is learning to love this club for the first time, is receiving their first red shirt, is watching their first match at Old Trafford or on a screen thousands of miles away, is falling into the particular orbit of this particular institution with the particular intensity that this club seems to inspire. That child will watch whatever comes next. They will suffer and celebrate and hope and despair and hope again, because that is what it means to support Manchester United, and it has always been what it means. From the muddy fields of Newton Heath to the lights of Old Trafford, from the railway workers to the global broadcast, from 1878 to whatever year you are reading or listening to this now. The history continues. The story goes on.